Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's going to make your stomach twist. And not just from fear, but from the realization that you could have walked right past it and never known. A rusted metal cart, some smoke, the scent of sizzling meat drifting through a Baltimore underpass, a man with dirty fingernails and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, serving what he claimed was pulled pork. But if you knew what he knew, what was really in that sandwich, you might not survive this. Before you dive deeper into this chilling truth, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there, and we'll dive into tonight's journey together. It was late, almost midnight, when the call came in. A maintenance worker had taken a shortcut past a row of overgrown trailers on the edge of an industrial park. He followed the faint smell of barbecue, sweet, greasy, familiar, until it turned rancid. He found the cart first, blackened on one side from years of heat, still warm, a pile of ash below the grates. He brushed it with a metal rod. Something shifted, a crack, not metal, not coal, bone, teeth. A jawbone, with flesh barely clinging to it, half-charred, lip curled in a grotesque grin. Inside the trailer behind the cart, the light was still on. Nobody answered his calls, just silence. And something else. The floor was sticky. The walls smelled like copper. A meat freezer in the corner buzzed softly. When the police arrived, they opened it. Inside, several vacuum-sealed packages labeled Reb, leg, shoulder, but none of them were from any animal known to the butcher's trade. The packages matched the missing parts of at least 2 women reported gone in the last 6 months. By the end of that week, investigators would find 7 shallow graves nearby. Not all had names. Some didn't even have heads. And still, the question lingered, who could do such a thing? Joseph Roy Metheny was born in 1955, in the grinding gray of western Maryland, the kind of town that smells like diesel and stale beer, where trailers sag on unpaved roads and kids grow up fast, or not at all. His mother worked double shifts. His father, an alcoholic, died in a car crash when Joe was just 6. The official version said he was raised in a loving, if overworked, home. The real version was different. Joe claimed she abandoned him, left him in foster homes, on the streets, wherever there was a floor to sleep on. She denied it. He had food, a bed. What more did he want? Maybe she wasn't lying, but something had already curdled in him, even then. As a boy, Joe was quiet, almost eerily so. Teachers remembered his size first, always the biggest kid in class. But more than that, they remembered how still he could sit, not blinking, just watching. One said she saw him once, staring at a crushed bird on the pavement for nearly an hour, not moving, just observing. He dropped out of school and joined the army at 18. It was structure, discipline, everything his childhood lacked. But it didn't stick. Records say he served honorably, but Joe told a different story years later. Heroin use in Southeast Asia, an addiction that slithered home with him. Whether he fought overseas or just imagined it, no one could verify. But when he came back, something inside him had changed permanently. He drifted. Construction work, warehouses, junkyards, places where no one asked too many questions. He was intelligent, articulate, even polite. His co-workers called him Tiny, with that cruel irony reserved for big men. He didn't mind. He even joked back. But he never brought anyone home. He lived alone, in a small trailer near the Patapsco River, parked behind an old pallet factory. No electricity, no neighbors, just him, the woods, and the things he kept buried underneath. In the late 1980s, he met a woman, a fellow addict. They had a child. Briefly, it looked like he might settle into something resembling a life. But then she vanished, taking the child and disappearing into Baltimore's drug underworld. Joe searched. He asked around, offering drugs, food, favors, but no one would talk. They called her a ghost. That word haunted him. And then something inside him snapped. He claimed it began with rage, a desire for revenge. But when he finally killed someone, it wasn't her. It wasn't even someone who had wronged him. It was just someone who had the misfortune of being near him when the storm inside him broke. To most, he was still just tiny, quiet, odd maybe, but helpful. He'd haul bricks, fix broken windows, work overtime without complaint. He never yelled, never seemed angry, never lost his temper. But by then, he'd already begun building something in the woods, a space, a system, a secret, a homemade pit in the ground, a collection of knives, rusted and mismatched, freezers, hooks, and eventually a barbecue smoker, welded together from salvaged oil drums and mounted on a cart with wheels. He said he'd open a food stand one day. People laughed, but they came, eventually, because the meat was good, because no one ever asked where he got it. It was July, one of those Baltimore nights when the heat sticks to your skin like oil and everything smells faintly of rot. That was when he chose her. She was young, 23 maybe, already hollowed out by addiction, barely noticed by the city around her. Her name was Kathy Magaziner. She was walking alone near Washington Boulevard, twitching and muttering, waiting for a fix, or someone who'd trade one for a favor. Joe pulled up in his battered pickup, offered her heroin and a place to stay cool for a while. She nodded without speaking. The trailer door closed behind them with a soft, final clunk. Inside, it was darker than night. The windows had been covered with tinfoil and nailed wood, sealing off the world completely. The air inside buzzed with the low hum of the freezer and the faint scent of meat gone sour. Kathy didn't ask questions. She was already half gone. He watched her for a while before he moved. Just sat, staring, like he had as a child with that crushed bird. Then he rose, reached behind the curtain, and pulled out the axe. He claimed later he didn't hesitate. Just swung, once, hard, into the side of her neck. She dropped, gurgling, convulsing on the linoleum. He stepped back and waited, watching the blood spread like oil. She didn't die quickly. That part stuck with him, not out of guilt, but fascination. The noises, the way the body resisted. When she finally stopped moving, he dragged her to the corner where the floor sloped slightly into a drain. He laid out the tools, a boning knife, a cleaver, a saw, the axe again, for the joints. He'd done this before, not to people, but meat was meat, right? He worked methodically, kept what he wanted, wrapped other parts in plastic, buried the skull. Then, carefully, he began the process of seasoning. He ground the shoulder meat first, added pork fat, paprika, garlic, onions. He'd done this before, too. Cooking had always soothed him. He found pleasure in precision, in smell, in control. 3 days later, the cart appeared. He parked it beneath an overpass where truckers and factory workers stopped. The smoke drifted into the street like a siren song. His sign read, "Home-style BBQ, $2 sandwich." He served them on white bread, no frills, slathered in a vinegar-heavy sauce. They ate quickly. Some came back for seconds. "If you mix it right," he would later say, "it tastes just like pork." He didn't feel guilt. He felt satisfaction. She was gone, consumed, literally, and no one had even noticed. No missing posters, no headlines, nothing. He called that moment his awakening. A week later, he went back to the same street, looking for someone else. They were easy to find. That was the worst part, how easy it was. Baltimore in the early 90s was a city bleeding at the edges. Crack and heroin ruled the corners, and people disappeared every night without names, without faces. Joe called them lost ones, and he made himself their final destination. Kim Spicer was next. She had a crooked smile, a needle mark on her arm, and nowhere to go. Metheny picked her up near Patapsco Avenue, told her he had drugs and food. She followed. They always did. The trailer welcomed her like a mouth closing around prey. This time, he didn't kill her right away. He fed her first. She complimented the meat. "Real tender," she said with a mouthful. Joe smiled. There was something about that. Serving them what had once been someone like them, a dark symmetry. He felt godlike. Then, when she was high and full and dazed, he brought out the extension cord. It was quieter than the axe, cleaner. He wrapped it around her throat and squeezed slowly, humming something tuneless as he watched her go. He buried her beneath the same factory slab, just feet away from the others. By the third victim, it had become a ritual. Tina, a sex worker from West Baltimore, never made it home. Her torso was discovered a year later, near the river, but the head was never found. That part he kept, in a freezer marked fish bait. For weeks, it stared up at him every time he opened the lid. He didn't mind. They came faster after that. He'd wait until he needed to restock, when the meat ran low, when business got too good. Then he'd drive out again, hunt and harvest. Always women. Always small, weak, forgotten. He experimented too. Different cuts, slow-cooked ribs, shoulder smoked with hickory chips, ground leg mixed with beef and onions. He served it with pride. People loved it. Some came weekly. They said it reminded them of their childhoods. One man even brought his kids. By the fifth killing, something changed in Joe. He stopped trying to justify it as revenge. He admitted to himself. He enjoyed it. The killing, the butchering, the feeding. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about power. He started taunting the police in his own way, left a bloody rag under a park bench, dropped a woman's ID card near a bus stop, just enough to stir questions, not answers. He built cages, 2 of them welded from scrap metal, just big enough for a woman to curl inside. He said he never used them, but then again, he lied about a lot of things. His stories got stranger. He told someone once that he chopped up a woman and served her to city workers at a Labor Day picnic. Another time, he claimed he ate part of a thigh himself, raw. Maybe he did. And all the while, no one suspected. The cart kept rolling. The meat stayed hot. The people kept eating, and the woods behind that factory grew quiet with the weight of so many secrets. When the calls came in, they were barely whispers. Names of women gone missing. Police shrugged them off. Junkies, runaways, prostitutes. That was the unspoken label that kept files at the bottom of drawers. No one was looking too hard. But that changed on December 8th, 1996. Rita Kemper had bruises around her neck and a split lip when she stumbled out of the woods, barefoot, bleeding, and terrified. She flagged down a passing trucker near the old pallet company on Washington Boulevard. Her story was incoherent, wild, almost unbelievable, but it was detailed. She told them about the trailer, about the man, about how she'd been lured inside with drugs and promises of warmth, only for the door to lock behind her. She said he tried to rape her, strangle her, that he told her she was next. She'd escaped through a broken window, sprinted into the trees, and never looked back. The police finally moved in. They expected a junkie's delusion. What they found was something else entirely. The trailer was silent. The door opened with a soft creak. Inside, bloodstains on the floor, a mattress so filthy it stuck to the wall, rusted blades laid out on a makeshift butcher table, and, at the back, a deep freezer humming like a heartbeat. Inside it, wrapped packages, again labeled like cuts of pork, but the shape of one, thin, arched, unmistakably a human femur, left no room for doubt. They dug near the pallet factory, where the ground sagged like a rotten tooth. What they uncovered was a graveyard, partial remains, bones burned down to ash, charred hair, teeth, bits of clothing, jewelry. Some victims were never identified. He didn't resist arrest. In fact, when they brought him in, Joe talked and talked. "I killed them," he said. "I cut them up. I cooked them. I sold their meat. You probably ate it." Detectives sat in stunned silence as he confessed to as many as 10 murders, though he claimed there were more. He said he dismembered them, used their parts in his roadside barbecue stand, and served it to anyone who came hungry. He laughed when he said, "If you mix it right, it tastes just like pork." But the details kept shifting. Sometimes he claimed he ate them himself, other times that it was all a story, a lie to mess with their heads. Evidence proved at least 2 of the women he described had been found. Kathy Magaziner's skull was dug up where he said it would be, buried in a shallow pit, the jawbone missing. Kim Spicer's remains matched blood found in the trailer. Yet despite all that, parts of his story couldn't be confirmed. There were no records of the barbecue cart, no photos, no receipts. The trailer was real, but the supposed customers who'd eaten his food, none ever came forward. Detectives began questioning whether Joe was exaggerating. Was he a serial killer or a manipulator, inflating the truth to sound monstrous? But then came the photo. In the corner of a worn Polaroid, taken outside a warehouse in late summer, stood Joe. He was grinning next to a rusty food cart, and just behind him, leaning on the grill, was a uniformed city sanitation worker. When asked, the man didn't deny eating the food. He didn't remember it clearly, just that it was damn good. No one laughed. Officers began reporting strange things during the investigation. Dreams of meat gone bad, a smell they couldn't wash from their skin. One swore he heard voices whispering in the trailer when he stood there alone. "Help me," it said. Faint, from beneath the floor. Maybe just the weight of horror. Maybe not. They thought they had the truth, but Joseph Metheny wasn't done talking, not by a long shot. In the interview room, he was calm, smiling, not proud exactly, but pleased, like a chef after a well-executed meal. He told them it hadn't just been about revenge. That part was real in the beginning. He believed his girlfriend had taken their son and left him for dead. He claimed he went searching for her in every gutter of Baltimore, and when he couldn't find her, he started killing women who looked like her. But somewhere along the way, he admitted, the need for revenge faded. The hunger stayed. He called his killings a release. He said they made him feel like God. "I created them. Then I destroyed them. Then I fed them to the people who ignored them." That line chilled the room. The horror wasn't just the murders. It was the cannibalism, the anonymity, the way he used society's indifference as a weapon. These women were discarded. He picked them up and turned them into something else, something people paid for. "You loved the taste," he told one detective. "You came back for seconds." The detective didn't answer, but there was something else, something that didn't sit right. When police traced his history, they discovered his arrest record went further back than they'd realized. Metheny had once been accused of attacking another woman years earlier, choked her nearly unconscious before she escaped. No charges were filed. She'd been too high to testify. Her name wasn't even recorded properly, just another forgotten voice. He'd also worked for a short time in a rendering plant, processing animal remains for industrial use. Blood, bone, fat. He knew what temperatures melted flesh from bone. He knew what meat looked like at every stage of decay. He knew what could pass for pork when smoked long enough. But the most damning moment came during a quiet afternoon review of the evidence logs. A junior officer noticed something odd in one of the locker bins. A rusted watch with initials carved into the back. DRM. It matched a missing persons report filed 2 years earlier by a man named Daniel Raymond. His sister had vanished after taking a job cleaning trailers. He'd mentioned her wearing a gifted watch. No one had ever connected her to Metheny. The watch had been photographed on Joe's wrist in one of his taped interviews, clear as day. They confronted him. He didn't flinch. She was tough, he said. Took longer than the others. But Daniel Raymond never got to see justice. He died by overdose 3 months before the trial. The city tried to bury the story. The media dubbed Metheny the cannibal of Baltimore, but only a few details were ever released to the public. Officials denied that human remains were sold as food. The health department issued quiet statements. The barbecue stand was never located. Some swore it was just a myth, but the cops knew. The photos, the bones, the confessions, they just didn't want anyone else to know. Metheny eventually recanted parts of his confession, claimed he made things up to scare people. He smiled during court, smiled when they gave him life without parole. No remorse, no apology, just a final statement that echoed through the silence of the courtroom. The only thing I feel bad about is that I didn't kill more. Even then, not all the bodies were found, not all the names known. Some of his claimed victims were never linked to remains. The cart was never recovered. The burner he used? Gone. And when asked where the meat had gone after the killings, he just shrugged and said, "You already ate it." Joseph Roy Metheny died on August 5, 2017, in his prison cell at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. No one visited. No one claimed the body. No last words were spoken. His death was ruled natural causes, but there was nothing natural about the legacy he left behind. The room he died in was stripped, sanitized, and reassigned. But some say the guards still avoid it. One swore the temperature drops when you pass that door. Another said she smelled meat once, burnt and sweet, the scent of something cooked too long. No explanation ever stuck. His remains were cremated, the ashes discarded, but questions remained. The trailer was destroyed, officially, bulldozed as evidence after the trial, buried under gravel behind the now defunct pallet factory. But locals claim that's not true. Some say they've seen it, hidden deeper in the woods, still intact, still standing, still locked. And then there's the cart. No one could find it. Not in impound, not in any evidence log. Some believed it was stolen. Others think it was sold at auction, cleaned up, passed from one food vendor to the next. You see, in the months following Metheny's arrest, the BBQ scene in Baltimore didn't die down. It surged. Pop-ups, roadside smokers, new recipes. People claimed to rediscover old flavors. Nobody asked where the meat came from. They never do. One woman, now in her 40s, still swears she remembers the sandwich. She was a kid then. Her dad brought it home after working late. "The best I ever tasted," she says, eyes distant. But it made me feel sick, like I'd eaten something I wasn't supposed to. She never ate pork again. In the years since, urban legends bloomed. Teenagers dared each other to visit the spot where the trailer once stood. Cops shared the story in hushed tones during night shifts. Sometimes people say, if the wind hits just right on Washington Boulevard, you can smell it. That faint tang of vinegar sauce, grease, and smoke. And once, in 2022, a man renovating a condemned row house found a freezer sealed behind a false wall. Inside were only bones, human, clean, sawn through the joint. But the most haunting thing? That house, it stood just 3 blocks from where Joseph Metheny once said his best customers lived. The city moved quickly. No headlines, no follow-up, no statement from the health department, just silence. So maybe he's gone, maybe. But what if he's still out there? Not him, but his recipe, his cart, his methods, his meat grinder passed on, quiet and unnoticed, rolling down another cracked sidewalk with the smell of pork and wood smoke curling into the dusk. And the house you just moved into? Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe it's where the last victim's body was found, and you still haven't opened the freezer in the basement. The body of Evelyn Miroth was discovered sprawled across the bedroom floor. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, eyes wide open in a frozen stare, though what they had seen in those final moments, No one could say. The room was a quiet battlefield. Blood painted the walls like wild brushstrokes, as if someone had tried to recreate violence as art. Her abdomen had been sliced open with a kitchen knife, organs removed, some missing entirely. The body was still warm. Her child's crib was nearby, empty. A coffee cup sat undisturbed on the nightstand. It was half full, still radiating heat. It suggested someone had interrupted her morning. Perhaps she had sat down for a sip before the knock at the door, before the monster entered. The smell of iron mixed with something more acidic, like bile. A bloody handprint was smeared on the doorframe leading to the bathroom, small and deliberate, as if the killer wanted someone to notice. Police officers later said the scene didn't look human. It was like walking into the set of a nightmare, one officer recalled, his voice thin. In another room, the body of Evelyn's 6-year-old son, Jason, was found curled up by the closet, bullet wound to the head. He had likely tried to run. The silence of the house was deafening, save for the occasional creak of a floorboard under a boot. Outside, the Sacramento sun burned through the winter air. Inside, time had stopped at the moment the killer left, walking out casually, carrying organs in a bucket, and leaving behind nothing but questions. A reporter would later write, "It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't passion. It wasn't even evil in the usual sense. It was madness in its rawest, wettest form." Who could do such a thing? Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. At first glance, his childhood looked ordinary, suburban, quiet, bordered by schoolyards and department stores. But inside the home, behind the pale blue curtains and tidy front lawn, tension simmered. His father was a strict disciplinarian, his mother distant and emotionally erratic. Richard grew up walking on glass, never knowing which version of his parents he would encounter. By his early teens, Richard displayed the first signs of disturbance. He tortured animals in secret, dismembering cats and setting birds on fire. He became fascinated by blood, its warmth, its color, the way it moved when it left a body. No one knew. No one saw. Teachers noted that he was often distracted, sometimes mumbling to himself, but his grades hovered around average, and he didn't cause trouble. He simply existed, vacant, hollow, drifting. A quiet boy with a vacant stare. A classmate would later recall, "He looked through you, not at you." As a teenager, his delusions deepened. He began to believe that his skull was shifting in his head. He shaved his hair and pasted oranges on his scalp, convinced they would absorb the poisonous energy his body produced. In his journals, found much later, he wrote of how his heart would stop beating for hours and how someone, somewhere, had stolen his pulmonary artery. Doctors labeled it paranoid schizophrenia, but no one intervened in time. In his early 20s, Richard was institutionalized briefly after injecting rabbit's blood into his veins and becoming violently ill. He explained to hospital staff that he needed to replenish his own blood supply because his was rotting. That phrase would return again and again like a refrain. "My blood is rotting," he would say. "It's drying up inside me." He was released after a short stay. Doctors noted improvement, but Chase was cunning. He took his medication only when watched. He learned what to say and how to sound sane. After discharge, he moved into a small apartment in East Sacramento. He painted the windows black, stacked furniture against the doors, and filled his refrigerator with raw animal organs. He blended them with Coca-Cola and drank them like morning shakes. No one visited. No one checked in. He purchased a gun. He began roaming the streets, testing doorknobs. If the door was locked, he walked away. But if it was open, he saw it as an invitation. It was December 29th, 1977, when Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and father of two, collapsed in front of his home while unloading groceries with his wife. One moment, he was reaching for a paper bag. The next, he was crumpled on the pavement, blood pouring from his chest. A single bullet to the heart, fired from a passing car, random, cold, and without warning. Witnesses saw a rust-colored station wagon speeding away. Police chalked it up to a gang initiation or drive-by, common assumptions in a city already weary of violence. But this was no initiation. 2 days later, neighbors reported a strange man wandering the area, attempting to enter homes. He rattled doorknobs, pressed his face against windows. At one house, he found the door unlocked. He entered and stole a handful of personal items and pet food. The homeowners returned to find a trail of urine across their hallway floor. Chase was escalating. On January 23, 1978, he found another door unlocked. This time, it belonged to Teresa Wallin, a 22-year-old 3 months pregnant. Her husband had just left for work. She was taking out the trash. She never saw him coming. Chase entered through the back door and confronted her in the hallway. He shot her 3 times with his .22 caliber pistol, twice in the head, once in the hand as she raised it in a futile defense. She fell backwards into the living room. What followed defied all understanding. Chase dragged her body to the couch. He fetched a carving knife from the kitchen. He slit her abdomen open and reached inside. He removed several organs, placing them neatly on a bathroom towel. He collected blood in a yogurt cup and drank it on the spot. Then he retrieved a dog feces from the yard and stuffed it into her mouth. Before leaving, he masturbated onto her corpse. Police found her body several hours later. The television was still on. The carpet was soaked in blood. They thought at first it was a sexual crime, but this was something else. Something ritualistic. Something deranged. The forensic team couldn't even catalogue all the wounds. Some were cuts, others were punctures, and some, disturbingly, appeared to be bite marks. They found a handprint in blood on the fridge handle. In the backyard, the garbage can was overturned, the contents smeared with blood and half-digested meat, likely from a dog. Investigators weren't sure if he had eaten it or used it in some grotesque mixture. One thing was clear. He hadn't come to rob. He had come for blood. Neighbors described a man seen walking up and down the street around that time, wearing a stained parka and muttering. When shown a sketch later, they'd say, he looked sick, hollow. The police now knew they had a problem far greater than they anticipated. They were hunting someone who didn't kill for revenge, money, or power. He killed because he believed he was dying, and only blood could keep him alive. Only 4 days passed before Richard Chase struck again. It was the morning of January 27, 1978, when he approached the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth. Inside, she was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David. Also in the house was her 6-year-old son, Jason, and a neighbor, Dan Meredith, who had stopped by to check on her plumbing. Evelyn was in the middle of changing David's diaper when the doorbell rang. Dan opened the door and was shot in the head at point-blank range. The shot echoed down the hallway, alerting Evelyn, who ran toward the commotion. Chase met her in the corridor. She screamed. He shot her in the head, and she collapsed where she stood. Then Jason appeared from his room. Chase shot him too. No hesitation, no mercy. The child fell without a sound. With 3 bodies now on the floor, Chase calmly closed the front door, drew the curtains, and locked the deadbolt behind him. He had all the time he needed. He dragged Evelyn's body to the bedroom and proceeded with a ritual that mirrored and surpassed what he had done to Teresa Wallin. He stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and chest. He opened her torso, removed her kidneys, her stomach, parts of her lungs. He bathed his hands in the blood, smeared it on the walls. He collected her blood in a cereal bowl and drank it. Then he retrieved a knife from the kitchen drawer, cut off one of her nipples, and chewed on it briefly before spitting it onto the carpet. He used a yogurt cup again to ladle more blood from the wounds. Beside the bed, he defecated and urinated on the floor. Then, in the bathroom, he washed his hands and drank from the faucet. But he wasn't done. He returned to the living room and took David's body. When police arrived hours later, called by a worried family member, they found a war zone. Blood pooled in the hallway, soaked into rugs, smeared on furniture. Dan Meredith's keys were still in the front door. Jason's body lay face down, stiff. Evelyn's corpse was mutilated almost beyond recognition. Her abdomen hollowed out, organs missing, a knife still embedded in her sternum. But the worst part was the crib. Empty. David was gone. Investigators found drag marks leading out the back door and across the yard. They searched the neighborhood, the trash bins, the nearby park. Nothing. The child had vanished. It wasn't until 2 days later, when Chase was arrested, that they discovered what had become of the boy. In a cardboard box, soaked in dried blood, they found David's remains, skull crushed, organs removed, a hole carved in the back of his head. Police believed Chase had used a coat hanger to stir the child's brain and drink the liquid that came out. The public reeled. News anchors hesitated over their scripts. Reporters used euphemisms like grisly, disturbing, inhuman. But none of those words fit. Not really. Because what do you call someone who walks into a home, murders a family, bathes in their blood, and then sits down for a glass of water as if nothing had happened? By now, Sacramento was in a state of quiet terror. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Gun stores had lines around the block. Parents kept their children indoors. No one answered the door without checking the peephole twice. And somewhere, walking the streets, was a gaunt, pale man with dead eyes, searching for his next unlocked door. The Sacramento police were unprepared for this level of carnage. At first, the killings seemed disconnected, a random drive-by shooting, a bizarre home invasion, and then a massacre. But the brutality, the blood rituals, and the absence of theft linked the crimes together with a signature so grotesque it couldn't be coincidence. Forensic analysis tied the bullets at both murder scenes to the same .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The bloody handprints, consistent across both homes, were smeared but matched in spacing. The killer wasn't covering his tracks. He didn't care. What disturbed investigators most was the absence of logic. There was no pattern to the victims, different ages, genders, neighborhoods. The only common thread? An unlocked door. Lead investigator Lieutenant Ray Biondi described the case as a descent into a type of madness we had never encountered before. Despite the urgency, early missteps slowed the case. Police canvassed neighborhoods too late. Witness statements weren't cross-referenced quickly. Sketches based on vague descriptions led to dead ends. But something did emerge. A woman recalled an encounter at a local gas station with a disheveled man in a dirty parka. He had asked her for a ride, muttering about needing to get more blood. She laughed nervously and drove away. She hadn't told anyone until she saw the composite sketch on television. Meanwhile, Chase was unraveling in plain sight. He returned to the same stores repeatedly, buying raw meat and pet food, always paying in coins, always reeking of sweat and something metallic. Cashiers remembered his fingers were stained dark brown, like dried blood. One said he spoke in fragments. "They watch me. I need iron. Blood's low again." Animal control received reports of missing pets. One neighbor claimed she saw him chase down a dog and carry it away under his coat. Another man found his cat nailed to his garage wall, the word "sick" written beside it in something that looked like feces. When the FBI's behavioral science unit was brought in, agents offered a chilling profile. White male, early 20s, socially isolated, severe mental illness, likely untreated, impulsive, ritualistic, and highly dangerous. They stressed he would kill again, and soon. But the final piece came from someone unexpected. Nancy Holden, a high school classmate of Chase, saw the news and recognized the sketch. Days earlier, at a shopping center, a gaunt man had approached her, calling her by name. She didn't recognize him at first, until he said, "We went to school together." He asked for a ride. She declined and walked away, unnerved. When she called police, they matched the name to a recent firearms registry. Richard Trenton Chase had legally purchased a .22 caliber pistol. His address was a mile from the last crime scene. Police staked out the apartment. Through a broken blind, they could see movement, just a flicker of a shadow. The front door was stained with something dark. No one answered their knock. They kicked it in. The smell was instant. Inside, the apartment was a chamber of horror. Blood coated the floor, the walls, the kitchen table. Every window was sealed with foil. On the counter sat a blender filled with red slush, partially blended organs and Coca-Cola. The fridge held animal parts and containers of blood. One of them had a child's name scrawled on the lid. There were knives in the sink, all crusted over. On the bed lay newspaper clippings about the murders. Drawn beside them in red marker were shapes, circles within circles, eyes that bled, bodies torn open. In the corner of the room was a pair of stained jeans and a parka. Inside the pocket, they found the keys to Evelyn Miroth's house. They arrested Chase without resistance. He didn't speak. He didn't fight. He simply smiled. In the interrogation room, Richard Chase sat motionless. His wrists were bound to the metal table, but he didn't seem to notice. He stared ahead, eyes cloudy, lips moving without sound. Detectives watched in silence as he whispered into the air, responding to voices only he could hear. It took hours before he acknowledged their presence. "I didn't kill them," he finally said. "I only took what I needed. My blood is dying." He spoke in riddles, claimed that Nazis had infiltrated his stomach and were turning his blood into powder, that his heart was shrinking, that someone had implanted a device behind his eyes. He was calm, eerily so. Over the next several weeks, psychiatrists evaluated him. The diagnosis was unequivocal: paranoid schizophrenia with violent psychosis. Chase believed his body was rotting from the inside, that the only way to survive was to drink blood, human blood. But the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. Inside his apartment, investigators found detailed notes, hundreds of pages, detailing experiments he had conducted on himself, diagrams of veins, maps of streets near elementary schools, calculations of how much blood he needed per day, recipes. One read, dog liver, 2 cups of human blood, 1 to 2 cup orange juice, blend, drink immediately. There were drawings of human figures with organs labeled. Some were crossed out, others circled. Most chilling was a list of names, people from his past, high school friends, neighbors, store clerks. Some had question marks beside them, others had notes: weak, safe, no blood, high iron. It became clear Chase had a system. He didn't kill at random. He watched. He chose. And if the door was locked, he left. But if it wasn't, he took it as permission. At trial, the defense pleaded insanity. They showed video of Chase in his cell, smearing feces on the wall, refusing food, and claiming he could hear people breathing through the mattress. They brought in experts who testified that he believed his bones were melting, that he feared his stomach would explode if he didn't consume blood. But the prosecution presented something else: survivors. A woman who had almost let him into her home on January 25th, the day before the final murders. She'd answered the door, saw his eyes, and slammed it shut. He stood there for 10 full minutes, breathing heavily, before leaving. She said she could feel him through the wood. Then came Nancy Holden, recounting her shopping center encounter: the dead cat, the stolen dogs, the yogurt cups of blood, the child's remains in a box. The jury saw a pattern, a ritual, a man who made deliberate choices. On May 8, 1979, Richard Chase was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by gas chamber. But he would never make it that far. Inside San Quentin State Prison, Chase remained isolated. Other inmates, hardened murderers, wanted nothing to do with him. They called him Dracula, whispered that he was cursed. He hoarded food and let it rot. He spoke of a machine in the ceiling that sucked out his soul at night. He was convinced guards were poisoning him. Then, on December 26, 1980, a guard making morning rounds found Chase slumped on his bed, pale, lifeless. In his hand was a small pile of crushed pills, antidepressants, and antipsychotics he had been secretly saving. On the wall, written in blood, were the words, "No more blood." The killer of 6 had ended his own life, not with violence, but with silence. But the whispers didn't stop. Neighbors of the Miroth house swore they heard crying at night, long after the case closed. The apartment Chase lived in was torn down, but nothing would grow on the lot. And somewhere in the police archives, Chase's drawings remain, locked in a box, sealed with tape, because no one wants to look at them again. They say madness leaves fingerprints, and some stains never wash out. Richard Chase is gone, but the shadow he cast never really left Sacramento. The families of his victims fractured. Some moved away. Others never left their homes again. Teresa Wallin's husband, who found her body that cold January afternoon, never remarried. He left his job, changed his name, and disappeared from public life. Evelyn Miroth's relatives refused to enter her home again. It was eventually sold, repainted, renovated, yet neighbors say no tenant stays more than a year. The house remains quiet, too quiet. Even today, retired officers who worked the case speak of Chase with a rare unease. They don't say the killer, they say him, like he's still lingering, somewhere between the walls of memory and myth. In schools across California, psychology courses reference the Chase syndrome, the belief in bodily decay leading to ritualistic behavior. His case is studied, but always cautiously, as if understanding him too deeply might leave a mark. The name Richard Chase still chills those who remember the 1970s, not because he killed, but because of how he killed, without motive, without anger, without purpose beyond his own twisted survival. He didn't hate his victims. He simply needed their blood. Some say that makes him more terrifying than any other killer of his era, because he wasn't driven by revenge or lust or greed. He was driven by something deeper, more unknowable, a broken brain convincing itself it was dying, and that others must die to save it. In the end, Richard Chase faded alone in a prison cell, the final page of his story written in self-inflicted silence. But what if silence isn't the end? What if, one night, in a different town, a man walks up to a home and finds the door unlocked? What if someone else out there, sick, paranoid, desperate, reads his story not as a warning, but as a guide? And what if you forgot to lock your door? Dean Corll, The Candyman, 1970-1973. The walls were sweating. In the Texas heat, even underground, the air refused to move. A deputy gagged behind his palm as the slab was lifted. The smell of rot and old bleach fought for dominance. One flashlight beam caught the corner first, white plastic sheeting folded tight. It glistened like wax paper from a lunchbox. The deputy crouched, peeled it back. What he saw didn't speak, but it told everything. A boy, face down, ankles tied with coated wire, wrists cinched behind his back with matching cord. His lips were blue, stretched in a final silent scream. A blood-stained gag, likely a rag from a t-shirt, was shoved so deep into his mouth that part of it had lodged in his throat. There was bruising on his back, small semicircles, bite marks. Duct tape hung loosely from his cheek, as if peeled off too late to matter. Just inches from his head was a pile of candy wrappers. Sweet, cheerful colors, red and yellow cellophane. the kind they gave away at the corner shop. Mixed among them were cigarette butts and 2 used syringes, one still partially filled with amber liquid. It wasn't just one body. The police had been digging all day. The crawl space was shallow, barely 3 feet, but they kept hitting bundles, sheets, bags, boys. They counted 7 by sunset, 21 by the end of the week. One officer whispered, "They're all boys, all tied the same." And somewhere in the silence between the buzzing generators and the soft crunch of dirt, the question returned over and over. Who could do such a thing? Houston in the early 1970s was growing fast, too fast to notice the cracks beneath its sidewalks. The Heights district, a modest neighborhood with fading charm, sat just northwest of downtown. Small homes with peeling porches and leaning fences dotted the streets. It was the kind of place where kids still played outside, barefoot and sticky-fingered, until the streetlights came on. Dean Arnold Corll lived in one of those houses. He worked at a small candy company his mother owned, a quiet, polite man who gave free samples to neighborhood kids. Everyone called him the Candy Man. He always smiled, rarely raised his voice. He lived with his mother until his 30s, and when she remarried and moved away, Dean stayed behind, alone. To anyone else, he was a little odd, but harmless, a bit withdrawn, kept to himself, played music too loud sometimes, and had different boys over now and then. That was all. But underneath the well-combed hair and clean button-downs, something festered. Dean was born in 1939, the elder of 2 boys. His father was distant, and his parents divorced when he was still a child. Dean was shy. Teachers noted he didn't socialize well. He avoided sports and preferred working with machines. In school, he had a near-obsessive focus on small things, like winding clocks or fixing radios, but he never seemed quite attached. When he was 11, he suffered from a rheumatic fever that kept him bedridden for months. Some speculate it affected his brain. Others say it just deepened something that was already there. After high school, Dean joined the military, serving in the army as a radio repairman. But he asked for a hardship discharge less than a year in. His mother needed help running the candy business. The army granted it. He returned to Houston, and something about him had changed. Co-workers said he was colder, more detached. He watched people too long, listened too little. A former employee recalled walking into the back office once and seeing Dean with a neighborhood boy, shirtless and unconscious on the couch. He said nothing, just closed the door again, and left the job a week later. No one reported it. Dean's candy factory closed not long after, but he kept the equipment, set it up in his garage. Kids still came by. He still had free samples. Then there were the parties. At first, it was just weed, a few beers. But soon, Dean started inviting teenage boys over for pills, quaaludes, barbiturates, amphetamines. He was always the one who supplied everything, and he never asked for money. They hung out in his apartment after school, sometimes spent the night. Dean bought them pizza, booze, let them smoke indoors. He seemed like a weird older friend, especially to David Brooks. David was just 12 when he met Dean, a quiet, wiry kid from a broken home. Dean bought him gifts, shoes, clothes, a used bike. Slowly, the boundaries blurred. By 15, David was practically living at Dean's house. He called him Sir. Dean called him Baby. David wasn't the only one. Another boy, Elmer Wayne Henley, came a little later, a few years older. He needed money. Dean offered it, first in small amounts, then hundreds of dollars, in exchange for help. Dean never said what the help was for at first, just that it involved keeping secrets, just that some of the boys who came over wouldn't be going home. No one believed teenagers could keep those secrets, but Dean knew better. He didn't just bribe them, he molded them, broke them, taught them to follow, and together they built a trap disguised as kindness. The Heights had no idea. One mother remembered Dean smiling at her from his porch as her son biked away, waving back. That boy never came home. The boy's name was Jeffrey Conan, 18 years old, soft-spoken, recently graduated. He wore glasses and walked with a slight slump, as if the world bore down just a little heavier on his shoulders. He'd told his parents he was going to hitchhike to a friend's house. It was the summer of 1970. He never arrived. Dean Corll saw him at the corner of 11th Street and Stewartwood. It was dusk, still warm, and the smell of car exhaust mixed with melting tar. Dean pulled up in his white van and rolled down the window. "Hot out," he said. "Need a lift?" Jeffrey hesitated. He was tired. The sun had worn him down. The man looked respectable, clean. He nodded. Dean told him there was a party at his place. Beer, music, girls. Said he could crash for a bit, get a cold drink. Jeffrey said yes. Inside the apartment, music played low, something ambient and repetitive, as if time itself had begun to loop. Dean handed him a drink and said, "Relax." That drink was drugged. Within minutes, Jeffrey slumped forward. Dean and David carried him to the plywood-covered bedroom, stripped bare, except for a small table, a roll of duct tape, and coils of nylon rope hanging on the wall like garden tools. There was a large wooden board, roughly the size of a twin mattress, lying on the floor. 2 handcuffs were bolted to the top corners. Dean called it the torture board. Jeffrey woke halfway through the binding. He blinked, confused, groggy. Then he realized he couldn't move his arms. He saw David standing off to the side, silent, looking down at the floor, and Dean, smiling. What followed spanned hours. Dean moved methodically, almost calmly, as if he were building something intricate. He used the tape, then the rope. He gagged Jeffrey with a sock, removed his clothing. The boy screamed into the cloth, eyes wide with panic. Dean struck him. Once, then again, until the panic drained out and the whimpering began. There was no pleasure in his face, no rage, just a strange, vacant concentration. David left the room. Later he would say he heard nothing but muffled sounds, banging, then silence. When he returned, Jeffrey was dead, his body still strapped to the board, face pale, streaked with tears. Dean wiped his hands on a towel. "First one's the hardest," he said, handing David a $20 bill. They buried the body in a rented boat shed on Silver Bell Street. Dean wrapped him in plastic, dug a shallow hole beneath the floor, and marked it with lime powder and a number. "Don't worry," he told David. "We'll be more careful next time." And he was. He refined the drugs, found stronger sedatives, learned the exact amount of pressure needed to strangle someone without crushing their windpipe, began recording names and dates in a small blue notebook, coded by nicknames. He was building a system, and the second boy didn't take long to find. James Glass, 14, disappeared while walking home from school. Dean knew him, had given him candy before, cigarettes once, told him there were BB guns at the house, free if he wanted to come look. This time, Elmer was there too. Elmer tied the knots, watched the whole thing. When it was over, he asked if it ever got easier. Dean just said, "Only if you stop feeling anything." A week later, Danny Yates, also 14, was killed the same way. Then 2 more boys. Then another. The bodies were buried in the same shed, in precisely spaced graves. Dean had found a rhythm. The boys were always teenagers, always slender, always alone, and no one was looking hard enough. Sometimes, parents reported their sons missing, but police marked most of them as runaways. It was the 70s. Kids disappeared all the time. Hitchhiking, drugs, bad crowds. They assumed the worst, but never this. Meanwhile, Dean was throwing parties again. He laughed louder, bought new speakers, got a dog, acted like a man unburdened. One night, Elmer saw him standing over a bound boy, naked, bleeding, and Dean looked up, almost proud. "Beautiful, isn't he?" Elmer didn't answer. He couldn't stop looking at the boy's eyes, open, but already fading. They came one after another, as if pulled by some invisible undertow beneath the streets of Houston. Charles Cobble, Donald Waldrop, Billy Balch, names that blurred into the ledger Dean Corll kept in his drawer, each written in the same crisp block letters, marked with the date and sometimes a detail. Tape, good, or cried, broke teeth. Between 1971 and 1973, at least 24 boys disappeared. Always teenagers, always thin, always familiar. Dean stopped using the boat shed when the space filled. He moved the bodies to other places, his rented storage unit, the beach at High Island, even his father's former property near Lake Sam Rayburn. Each grave was shallow, plastic-wrapped, and catalogued. He carried lime powder like a farmer carried seed. By then, Elmer and David weren't just helping, they were hunting. Dean promised them $200 for every new boy they brought. He showed them how to pick. The kids who looked lost, the ones who seemed hungry, too trusting. He said it was a party. Sometimes the boys believed that. Sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. Elmer was 17 when he helped bind his first victim. The boy's name was Frank Aguirre. He'd just clocked out from his job at a local restaurant. Dean offered him a ride. Elmer sat next to him in the van. Frank knew him, trusted him, even laughed. That was the last thing Frank did. Inside the house, Frank realized something was wrong when Dean locked the door. He turned, asked why. Dean punched him. Elmer flinched but didn't move. Dean grabbed handcuffs from the table and tossed them at Elmer. "Do it," he said. Elmer hesitated, then snapped the cuffs onto his friend's wrists. That night, Dean tortured Frank for hours. Screams echoed against the drywall. At one point, Dean left the room, came back with a knife, and said calmly, "Let's see what's inside." Later, they buried Frank's body near a power line station. Dean made Elmer help dig. The pattern held. A few weeks passed. Another boy vanished. Then two. Some were lured from bus stops. Others brought in by David, who would tell them Dean had beer and pills. One was a hitchhiker from Baton Rouge, who never even knew the city he died in. The methods grew crueler. One boy was kept alive for 3 days. Dean broke his fingers, burned him with a soldering iron. Another had his genitals crushed before being strangled. Some were drowned in bathtubs. Others were killed by garrote, using a thin wooden board Dean had drilled with eyelets and wire. Blood pooled on mattresses, soaked into the wood. At one point, the neighbors complained about the smell. Dean blamed it on clogged pipes, but nothing leaked into the street. The rot was contained. He always cleaned, except the dreams. Elmer began waking up with nosebleeds. He'd hear the dead boys' voices in the shower. Saw one, wet and broken, sitting in the corner of Dean's bedroom, staring. David started drinking more, stopped speaking during car rides. One night, he vomited after helping bury a boy who'd been only 13. Dean slapped him, told him to man up. But cracks were forming. They killed 2 boys in one night, Randall Harvey and Mark Scott. Dean said he wanted to see who lasted longer under torture. Mark fought back, broke free of the board, tried to run. Dean shot him in the back with a revolver. Elmer watched him die. He didn't blink. At that point, even the accomplices felt there was no way out. They were in too deep, knew too much, and somewhere inside, both believed Dean was invincible. "He's like the devil," David said once. "He don't get caught. Not ever." Dean started talking about building a cabin in the woods. "Just me and you," he told Elmer. "We could take boys up there, keep 'em alive longer." Elmer didn't respond. He thought of the cabin, the silence, no one for miles. That's when he started hiding things. A pocket knife in his sock, a key under the mattress, a plan still forming. Dean had begun to trust him completely, left him alone with the bound boys, let him experiment. Elmer didn't, but he didn't stop Dean either. The final straw came in August 1973. Dean had brought 2 boys in that night, Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams. Rhonda was unusual, a girl. Dean didn't like girls, but Elmer had invited her, said she needed a place to crash. He didn't expect Dean to let her stay. That night, Dean exploded. "You ruined everything," he told Elmer. "Now I've got to kill them all." Rhonda tied to a chair, Timothy handcuffed. Dean stormed around the room, gathering his tools. Elmer watched him and decided. It was almost 4 a.m. when Dean shoved the gun into his hands. "Hold it on 'em," he barked. "Don't let them move." Elmer turned the gun, pointed it at Dean. Dean laughed. "You won't," he said. Elmer pulled the trigger. The first shot hit Dean in the forehead. He stumbled back, eyes wide. The second caught him in the chest. He hit the wall, slumped. The third missed, but Dean was already collapsing. Blood ran down the paneling in thick trails. Dean didn't scream. He just looked up, stunned, as if betrayed. Elmer dropped the gun. David stood frozen. The room went silent. And for the first time in years, no one screamed behind those walls. The call came just after dawn. A young man named Elmer Wayne Henley had walked into a neighbor's house, shaking, barefoot, his shirt spattered with blood. He said he'd shot a man, said there were bodies. So many bodies. The police didn't believe him at first. It sounded like rambling, a drug-fueled panic. But he was calm, too calm, said the name clearly, Dean Corll, gave them an address, told them where to find the gun. When officers entered the home on Lamar Drive, they weren't prepared for what they found. There was blood, yes. Dean's body slumped against the bedroom wall, half his head blown open, the eyes dull and open. But it was the smell that told the real story. It was soaked into the floorboards, clinging to the walls. Decay, and something worse. Formaldehyde, bleach, rotting flesh. The officers moved through the house with slow, mechanical steps. The living room was normal, the kitchen unremarkable, but the hallway led to something else. They opened the door to what looked like a storage room. That's when the screaming started. A wooden board stained dark brown. Rope, handcuffs, a box of knives, a jar of Vaseline, plastic sheets folded neatly in a milk crate, duct tape, chains, bloodstains on the carpet like watermarks left behind by unseen tides. A second officer vomited into the sink. By noon, the neighborhood was crawling with detectives. Henley sat in the back of a squad car, hands cuffed, staring at the house as if seeing it for the first time. "I'm glad I killed him," he said. "I couldn't take it anymore." They brought him downtown. What unraveled over the next few days was chaos. Elmer confessed everything, the murders, the burials, the names he remembered, the places they went. He talked until his voice cracked. At one point, he broke down and whispered, "We could have saved some of them." He led them to the boat shed on Silver Bell Street. The padlock was rusted. Inside, the air was stale and metallic. Shovels scraped the concrete floor. The first body was only 3 feet down. Then another, and another. All wrapped. All boys. Some still with gags in their mouths. One was wearing a school ring. Police stood in circles, stunned, their boots soaked in mud and the dark runoff of a nightmare. By the end of the dig, they had uncovered 17 bodies from the shed alone. More followed on a rented lakeside property at High Island Beach. The final count was at least 28, possibly more. Corll hadn't documented everyone. Most had similar injuries, ligature marks, broken bones, signs of prolonged torture. Some were sexually mutilated. One had been castrated with what appeared to be a hunting knife. 2 were so decomposed that only partial skulls remained. Reporters flooded in from across the country. Houston's police force, long criticized for its apathy toward missing teenagers, especially runaways, came under fire. Parents stood at barricades screaming, demanding answers. Some collapsed when handed photographs of shoes, wallets, necklaces. "This one," an officer would say, holding up a broken wristwatch. "Do you recognize this?" One mother fainted on the spot. The press dubbed Corll the Candyman. The nickname stuck like rot. They showed photos of his factory, his van, his smiling face beside birthday cakes and neighborhood kids. The contrast was unbearable. The police tried to rewrite the narrative. Swift action, justice served. But the truth bled through. They had dismissed dozens of missing reports. Said boys probably ran away. They'd even brought one victim, Willard Branch, back to Corll's house after the teen had escaped half-naked and bleeding, begging for help. Dean had convinced the officers it was a lover's quarrel. They left him there. That boy was never seen again. Among the evidence collected were audio tapes, low-fidelity recordings of boys screaming. One officer, after listening, took a leave of absence and never returned. Another, who supervised the autopsies, burned out within a year. But not everyone believed the case was fully closed. A retired homicide detective later stated that the number could be much higher. "There are boys we never found," he said. "He had access to the river. There are woods out there so thick we may never know." Some even questioned the full role of the accomplices. David Brooks, arrested days after the shooting, remained emotionless during questioning. He denied active participation. Elmer, in contrast, confessed everything, then broke down in a holding cell, curled into the corner like a child. "Sometimes," he said, "I can still smell them." To this day, the photos remain sealed in certain police archives. Too disturbing, too graphic. Evidence rooms hold the ropes, the boards, the knives, but one piece is always missing: the why. No diary, no manifesto, no explanation. Just a quiet man with candy in his pockets and 28 boys beneath the floor. For 3 years, Dean Corll operated in plain sight. A quiet man with a tidy house, a fondness for music, and an unusual amount of teen visitors. He paid his rent on time, waved to neighbors, drove a white van. It was only after the gunshots on August 8, 1973, that anyone understood what he really was. But the twist was this: the police didn't catch him. The courts didn't stop him. Justice didn't come from above. It came from below, from a boy he'd trained, shaped, broken, who, in the end, turned and shattered the monster he helped feed. Elmer Wayne Henley wasn't supposed to pull the trigger. He was supposed to obey. Dean had groomed him carefully, through attention, money, power. At first, he treated Elmer like a son, then like a soldier, finally, like a partner, but not an equal. Dean never intended to let them go, not Elmer, not David. They were as disposable as the others, and Elmer had begun to see it. He noticed how Dean watched him differently after a failed abduction, how he hesitated to pay, how he talked less, clenched his fists more. The control slipped, barely noticeable, but it was there. Then there was that night. Rhonda Williams, the girl who changed everything. Dean had invited Timothy Curley over. He wasn't expecting a second guest, let alone a girl. Dean didn't like girls, said they ruined the balance. But Elmer, for once, had done something on his own. He was testing Dean. Rhonda had known Elmer since childhood. She trusted him. So did Timothy. They played music, smoked a little, laughed. Then Dean came in with handcuffs. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. They were tied up within minutes. Dean paced, furious. Said Elmer had betrayed him. Said he'd kill them all. And maybe he would have, if Elmer hadn't made a decision. "I'll help you," he said, "but let me go first." Dean handed him the gun. That was the last mistake he ever made. Elmer didn't hesitate, shot him in the forehead. The shot stunned the room. Dean staggered, fell. Elmer walked forward, fired again into his chest. Then again. The man who had killed at least 28 boys, the one they all feared, obeyed, even loved in some twisted way, was dead in seconds. And yet, even as Dean bled out onto the floor, the terror didn't fully lift. Because the boys he killed weren't strangers to the city. Some were neighbors. Some had knocked on Dean's door before, looking for work, a ride, or just candy. One had been Elmer's classmate. And it wasn't just the killer who had blood on his hands. The city looked the other way. Teachers, officers, neighbors, parents. There were warning signs, stories that didn't add up, screams in the night, boys who disappeared and were never searched for. One boy had run from Corll's van screaming, but the witness said he was probably high. Another time, a boy was spotted gagged in the back of the van, but Dean explained it away as a prank. They laughed, let it slide. David Brooks told police he always assumed someone else would stop it, but no one did, until Elmer pulled the trigger. The deeper truth was uglier still. Some of the victims may not have been innocent. One boy, whose body was found beneath the boathouse, was once part of Corll's ring. He helped lure others. Then he got scared, wanted out. Dean killed him too. Corll had created a self-consuming machine, young boys luring young boys, a cycle of guilt, fear, obedience. When one lost value, he became the next victim, disposable. There are names Elmer couldn't remember, faces blurred by time and trauma. Some bodies were never matched. They could have been from other cities, other states, even Mexico. Dean traveled often, had storage keys the police never found, bank accounts under aliases. A few detectives believe he didn't act alone beyond David and Elmer, that there were others, men he sold photos to, bodies he disposed of for profit. Some say he filmed parts of what happened, and those tapes were never recovered. In sealed court documents, an unnamed witness once described a man who watched from the closet during one of the murders. They never found him. Maybe he never existed. Maybe he still does. The full truth never came. What remained were fragments, blood on a wall, names in a ledger, and the boy who destroyed the devil he once served. I was part of it, Elmer said during his trial, but I ended it. The jury didn't care. He was convicted of 6 murders, but the world remembered him not as a killer, nor a savior, but something in between. A boy caught in a storm of evil, and the only one who ever fired back. They buried Dean Corll without ceremony. No headstone, no mourners, just a patch of dirt in Houston's Forest Park Cemetery beneath a number. His father refused to attend. His mother defended him until the day she died, called him a good son, a patriot, a gentle soul. She said the boys were liars, that Elmer was a murderer, but the city knew better. After the case broke, houses in the Heights went up for sale in waves. Families left. Rumors spread about the crawl spaces beneath old homes, the boathouse with its black floor, the sound of sobbing sometimes heard near Silver Bell Street after dark. For years, no one built on the lot where the shed once stood. Elmer Wayne Henley remains in prison. He's been eligible for parole multiple times and denied every time. He writes letters, paints, gives interviews. In one, he said, "I was a killer's dog, and then I bit him." David Brooks, more reserved, died in prison in 2020. Cancer. He never spoke much, but in a letter to his wife, he once wrote, "God forgives children. I just don't know if I ever was one." There are still unanswered questions. To this day, 3 of the bodies remain unidentified. No missing persons report ever matched them. No grieving parent came forward. Some say they were street kids or boys from other counties. Some believe the true number is closer to 40. Dean kept no journal, but investigators found a small wooden box in his bedroom, beneath the floorboards. Inside were trinkets, a boy's ring, a broken harmonica, a strip of film too decayed to develop. Souvenirs. proof of ownership. After the murders, one family moved into Dean's old home, unaware of what had happened. They lasted 3 nights, said they heard footsteps in the attic, tapping on the walls, a child crying beneath the floor, but the crawl space was empty, no matter how deep they dug. Israel Keyes, the serial killer who planned like a ghost. The snow around the body hadn't fallen gently. It had been kicked up, churned, disturbed by something violent. A crimson spatter spread in fragile ice crystals over the compacted earth, like paint thrown in sudden rage. Samantha Koenig's remains were found half-curled beside a frozen creek outside Anchorage, Alaska. Her limbs were stiff with the grip of February cold, but her face, what was left of it, was not at peace. Her eyelids had been sewn open, not with medical precision, but with something slower, something deliberate. The thread cut through thin skin, stretched it taut, pulling her expression into a grotesque mask of surprise. Her mouth had been glued shut. Later, investigators would discover her body had been kept frozen for nearly 2 weeks after her death, posed, then staged, made to look alive in a chilling photo sent to her family with a ransom note. In the picture, she was reading a recent newspaper. They didn't know then that she had been dead for days. Her wrists were tied with paracord, but not carelessly. The knots were military, tight, layered, meant to restrain for hours without damaging the rope. Duct tape had been wrapped around her fingers, not to silence but to preserve prints. It was a game of control, of ownership. She had vanished from her coffee kiosk without a scream. Surveillance footage showed her leaving calmly, walking with a man in a hoodie. No struggle, no chase. He had simply taken her, like a shadow slipping through an unlocked door. Who plans like that? The detectives would ask the same question a dozen times before the truth came. He didn't choose the girl. He chose the location. He had buried the tools to kill her a full year before they even met. In the rural stretch of Utah, where Israel Keyes was born in 1978, isolation wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. His parents, devout fundamentalist Mormons, who later converted to a fire and brimstone form of Christianity, raised their large family in the woods with no electricity, no running water, and no connection to the outside world. Their homestead was surrounded by trees thick enough to swallow voices and far enough from neighbors that a scream would die before it reached another human ear. Israel was the second of 10 children. He rarely spoke. He didn't need to. In a house governed by strict religion and survivalist values, obedience was the only acceptable language. When he disobeyed, his punishments came swiftly and in silence, locked in closets, made to sleep outside in the snow. Pain, he learned early, didn't require explanation. By age 7, he could gut a deer, sharpen a hunting knife, and disappear into the woods for days. He began to enjoy it, being invisible, being quiet. Animals became his first obsession. He caught birds, squirrels, and cats, dissected them with the same detachment he'd seen in his father's skinning rituals. No one asked questions. In the Keyes family, pain was discipline, and silence was strength. In adolescence, the family moved to Washington State, closer to the compound of a white supremacist Christian identity church. There, Israel grew up among radical ideology, but never spoke much of race or God. He began reading books on serial killers, Bundy, Dahmer, Kemper. He noted their mistakes. Unlike them, he didn't crave fame. He craved invisibility. By 20, he had joined the army, stationed at Fort Lewis. To his fellow soldiers, he was quiet, competent, friendly in a reserved way. He didn't drink often, but when he did, he laughed too much. He earned sharpshooter status. He memorized maps, learned code, studied procedure. In private, he experimented with breaking into homes, not to steal, but just to stand there, breathing in the normal lives of others. After his discharge, he became a general contractor. He built fences, renovated homes. To clients, he was polite and punctual. They remembered his soft voice and how he never left a mess. He had a daughter, a house, a girlfriend. Photos showed him smiling at birthday parties. He was always smiling. But by 2001, something had shifted. He started traveling more, alone. Long road trips that left no trail. He called them adventures. In reality, they were dry runs. He would pick a city, not a person, and fly there with no luggage. Somewhere, buried in a park or a forest on a previous trip, was a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket. Inside, cash, weapons, zip ties, duct tape, bleach, and silencers. He called them kits. He never touched them twice unless he was ready to kill. No one suspected him because no one could see him. He paid for everything in cash. He kept his phone off. He wore gloves even in summer. There was no pattern in his movement, no obsession with a victim type. He didn't stalk. He didn't fantasize. He executed. Between jobs, between parenting weekends, Israel Keyes began stitching together a private map of death. He buried containers in Florida swamps, New York woods, Arizona deserts. He studied topography, weather, and park traffic flow. He became fluent in erasure. He wasn't hunting yet, but he was building the cage. And somewhere in that quiet part of his mind, the part trained to be still, to wait, he was counting down. It began in Vermont. The kit had been buried 2 years earlier, on a hiking trail outside Essex. Beneath a pile of stones just off the path, marked only in his memory, waited a sealed bucket, dry despite 2 winters. He had placed it carefully. At night, wearing gloves, using a red lens flashlight to avoid attention. The tools inside had not been touched since. Inside, a .22 Ruger pistol with a homemade silencer, rolls of duct tape, nitrile gloves, rope, a ski mask, a shovel, and Drano. The Drano was for the bodies, an idea he'd picked up from other killers who had failed to vanish without trace. On a warm June night in 2011, Israel Keyes arrived on foot. He had chosen the house weeks before. A white colonial, isolated at the edge of a cul-de-sac. No nearby streetlights. A couple in their 50s lived there. Retired, no kids at home. The house backed up to woods, thick enough for a body to vanish. He had scouted it with binoculars, counting lights, noting car schedules. He waited until 2 a.m. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds. No dogs barked. He cut the phone lines first. Then he entered the basement window he'd loosened earlier that week, crept up the stairs, and into the master bedroom. He wore all black, his ski mask tight. He moved like a machine, quiet, exact. The husband woke first. The gun was pressed to his forehead before a word could form. Don't scream, don't move. He zip-tied them both, wrists and ankles. He gagged the wife with a piece of towel. She cried softly through the cloth, but didn't fight. They thought it was a robbery, maybe even a kidnapping. He led them, one by one, into the garage. There was no car in it, just a plastic tarp already spread across the floor. He made them kneel. The husband asked him why. Keyes didn't answer. He shot the man in the back of the head first. The wife screamed under the gag, muffled and frantic. She tried to crawl away, but made it only a few feet before he pulled her back by the ankle. He looked her in the eyes. Later, when asked why, he would say, I wanted to see if it made any difference. It didn't. He killed her the same way. 2 shots, close range. He wrapped the bodies in the tarp and dragged them into the woods behind the house. The soil was soft enough. He dug for hours, hands blistering through gloves. When the hole was deep enough, he poured the Drano over their faces, then covered them with soil and branches. It was nearly dawn. Before he left, he cleaned everything. Bleach across the garage, doorknobs wiped, zip ties removed, windows shut tight. He flew home to Alaska the next morning, paid in cash, took no luggage. He was back at work by Monday. No report was filed, no Amber Alert, no missing persons flyer. The house was quiet for days. Eventually, A neighbor noticed the newspapers piling up. Police found the door locked, no sign of forced entry. The garage was spotless. The couple was listed as missing. No ransom call, no struggle, no motive, just a sudden absence. Keyes watched the story online. He bookmarked it. He added a red dot to his private map, then closed the file. That was his first known kill. But there had likely been more before it. Murders unconnected, unspoken. He hadn't come out of nowhere. He had simply never left footprints. By 2012, Israel Keyes had made murder part of his routine. Not an obsession, not something compulsive. It was calculated, contained. He didn't kill out of rage or madness. He killed to maintain control, to stay invisible. His murders were vacations from normalcy. No trophies, no phone calls to taunt police, no pattern. After Vermont, he moved quickly. A month later, he was in Indiana. He rented a car under a false name, paid in cash, drove 4 states south to a park, where he had buried another kit beneath a rotting log. The cache was identical. Gun, shovel, ropes, bleach, gloves. Always gloves. He walked into a campground just before dusk. She was alone, mid-30s, reading in a folding chair outside her RV. He approached slowly, a map in hand, asking for directions, smiling, relaxed. She never made it inside. The police found the RV the next day, empty, unlocked, her purse and phone still inside. No blood, no broken windows. Her body was never recovered. Keyes had dragged her into the woods, miles off trail, where he'd already prepared a hole. There, he bound her, strangled her, and buried her still warm. The Drano came later. Each scene played out like that. Short, brutal, silent. One in New York, a jogger along a lake trail, never made it home. One in Texas. A couple parked near a rest stop vanished overnight. Each kit had been in place for months, sometimes years, and once used, they were either reburied or destroyed. He never struck twice in the same state. He made sure flights had no layovers. If he drove, he'd steal license plates and swap them between gas stations. He paid in cash, slept in his car, avoided cameras. No one could trace the crimes. They couldn't even prove they happened. But the cruelty deepened. In Oregon, a man was found in a shallow grave, his torso missing. The remains were discovered by a dog walker in the forest. His fingernails had been removed. His chest had been opened, organs removed. There was no known connection to Keyes, except for the kit they found nearby. It was buried in rusted steel, not plastic, wrapped in thick canvas. Inside, bones of small animals, blood-stained gloves, and an ID badge of a woman missing since 2009. That badge shouldn't have been there. She had disappeared in Illinois. Forensic experts speculated the killer moved the bodies between states, purposely disorienting law enforcement. One cop described it as playing chess across the map, with no pieces on the board. Then came Alaska. Samantha Koenig was taken in February 2012. Unlike the others, her case had public weight. Cameras caught her abduction. Her family begged for her return. Keyes, for once, engaged. He sent a ransom note, posing her body to make it look alive. He demanded money from her bank account, using her ATM card in multiple states, as he drove from Texas to New Mexico to Arizona. Surveillance cameras showed a man in a ski mask, always alone, always calm. She had been dead since the night she vanished. He had killed her, then stored her body in a shed behind his home in Anchorage. For days, he went about life, picked up his daughter, smiled at neighbors, shoveled snow. He sewed her eyelids open, applied makeup, took the photo. He even braided her hair. The picture haunted investigators, not for its content, but for what it implied, that the killer had time, space, privacy. He was local. He had inserted himself into the heart of the manhunt, and no one saw him. But cracks were forming. A careless ATM withdrawal in Arizona led to footage, then a rental car receipt. A highway patrol officer in Texas pulled over a man for a minor infraction. It was Israel Keyes. He had Samantha's ATM card in his wallet. The weapon was in the trunk. But when they arrested him, he said nothing. Not at first. And then, slowly, he began to talk. But only about some of it. The interrogation room was bare. Just a table, 2 chairs, a recording device blinking red. Israel Keyes sat with his wrists cuffed, his posture relaxed. He spoke softly, as if the details didn't belong to him, as if he were remembering a documentary, not recounting his own crimes. He told them where to find Samantha Koenig's body. It was under the ice of Matanuska Lake, weighted with chains. He had taken a snow machine across the frozen surface to drill the hole himself. He watched her sink into the dark beneath, then covered the spot with powder. Clean, erased. She was the only one who wasn't random, he admitted. She was a risk. I broke my own rule. He gave no names for the other victims, only locations. A farmhouse in Vermont, a body buried in the woods of New York, a woman's remains scattered across an Oregon ravine. Always vague, always incomplete. He mentioned a murder map, a private set of coordinates he'd created, stretching across the United States, where his kits were buried, where he had killed, where he had planned to kill. He described it like a puzzle with half the pieces hidden. Investigators tried to extract more, offering coffee, meals, even a cigar. Sometimes he accepted. Sometimes he stared at the wall for hours, silent. The FBI formed a task force. They flew agents to old sites, Essex, Vermont, Tupper Lake, New York, Wilcox, Arizona. They found disturbed ground, bullet casings, partial remains. But the identities of the victims stayed unknown. One survivor surfaced, barely. A woman in Oregon recalled waking up in her own car, a strange man in the driver's seat. She had been drinking earlier that night and assumed it was a friend, but something about him was off. He said nothing. She jumped at a red light and ran. She remembered the shape of his hands, clean, calloused. She remembered the smell of bleach. The police dismissed her report, too vague, too unlikely. There were other strange threads. A missing hiker in Utah whose dog returned alone. A couple whose tent was found zipped from the outside in, near a fire pit still warm. Local police shrugged. People disappear all the time. They didn't see the invisible stitching holding the deaths together. Until the Koenig case, Keyes had never repeated a location, never touched technology, never spoke to victims. He left behind no fiber, no DNA, no link to his other life. That's what made him dangerous. Most people can't separate the parts of their life, he said during one interview. But I had rules, compartmentalization. You can be a good father and still enjoy killing. He smiled when he said that. Even his family didn't know. His girlfriend had suspicions, long absences, strange cash hoards, bruises on his hands. But she thought maybe he was cheating, or gambling, or hiding debt. She never imagined what lay beneath the concrete in other states. The case began to rot in its own confusion. Every new breadcrumb led to another dead end. There were rumors. A psychic called the Anchorage Police, claiming Samantha's ghost had visited her in a dream, said she was cold, said her body was under black glass. They ignored the call. A prison nurse said Keyes sometimes talked in his sleep. Not words, whispers, names she didn't recognize. Once, she heard him say, "They're still waiting in the dirt." Even agents who didn't believe in omens began to feel it, something lingering in the air, in the gaps between Keyes's confessions. A weight, a pressure, and always that feeling that they were too late. Because even when they had him in a cell, they didn't really have him. He still held the map. He never gave them everything. Even with his wrists shackled, even in that cell beneath layers of security, Israel Keyes held the upper hand. His secrets were currency, and he rationed them with surgical control. "I'll give you one more," he told the FBI. "But I want a cigar, and I want to watch the sunrise." He got both. That morning he described a woman abducted in New Jersey. She'd been camping alone. He'd followed her from a gas station, waited until her fire was out. He never spoke to her, just dragged her by her hair into the dark. Her body, he said, was near a reservoir. No name, no date. When asked why, he shrugged. She was there, and I was ready. But even in confession, Keyes omitted key details. For every crime he described, there were two more he hinted at, and then let drift into silence. Sometimes he'd begin a story and stop halfway through. There was a guy near Spokane. I left him in the river. Then nothing. Other times, he toyed with them. "There's one you'll never find. I used the concrete at a new housing development. Slabs already poured. They walk on him now." But the most chilling revelation came not in what he said, but what they found. In a search of his computer, investigators discovered a scanned map, unlabeled, just dots scattered across the US, each with a color code: red for completed kills, blue for caches, yellow for sites under surveillance, places he had considered. There were over 24 marks. Some corresponded with active investigations. Others matched nothing at all. At least 8 blue dots had no kits recovered. That meant the buckets were still out there, buried beneath leaves or dirt or snow. Fully equipped, ready, just waiting for someone to dig. The FBI tried to pressure him, to map every kit, every name, every plan. He resisted. "I've given you enough," he said. "The rest stays with me." In court, he showed no emotion, no remorse. He waived his right to trial. He offered to plead guilty if they guaranteed he wouldn't face the death penalty, only life. When asked why, he said he didn't want to die. Not yet. But inside his cell, something had begun to fray. He stopped eating, then started again. He became erratic, one moment quiet, the next combative. He told the guards he heard footsteps in the ceiling. He tore up his mattress, scratched words into the walls. "We are one. There is no key." And then, one morning in December 2012, he was found dead. He had slit his wrists with a disposable razor, embedded into a pencil. The wound was deep. But that wasn't all. He had also used bed sheets to hang himself from a ceiling fixture. Belt and noose, redundant, certain. He had left behind no confession. Just 13 pages of drawings, skulls, demons, decapitations. One featured 11 skulls, each with different eyes. A coded count of his victims? Or something else? No one knows. Because the truth had always lived only inside him. He was the kind of killer who planned not just murders, but his own vanishing act. His final weapon wasn't a gun or rope. It was silence. They buried him in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no ceremony, just dirt, a number, and the weight of everything he refused to say. Israel Keyes died as he lived, quietly, deliberately, and a few steps ahead. The FBI closed the file with reluctance. They couldn't name most of the victims. They couldn't find half the crime scenes. His murder map, recovered from the laptop, remained only partially decrypted. Of the 8 confirmed kill kits still unrecovered, searches were launched in 4 states. All failed. Some were likely destroyed by floods, animals, or time. Others, they suspect, still rest exactly where he left them, waiting beneath layers of pine needles, or snowdrift, or packed dirt near trails no longer marked on maps. And maybe, one day, someone will find one. A hunter reaching for firewood. A child building a fort. A ranger spotting rust poking through the soil. They'll find the bucket, open it, and inside they'll see a life paused at the edge of horror. Gloves sealed in plastic, a pistol cleaned and oiled, rope coiled like a sleeping snake. And they'll wonder, was it used already? Or was it meant for someone else? Keyes' house in Anchorage sat vacant for months. Eventually, it sold cheap to a couple from out of state. Young, newly married. She teaches music at the local school. He works in construction. They've painted the walls, replaced the flooring, and pulled up the shed in back. A new garden grows where the old foundation stood. Sometimes they hear strange creaks at night. Sometimes their daughter says there's a man watching from the trees. But they laugh it off. They say it's just the wind, or the dark, or the snow shifting on the roof. Still, somewhere out there, the ground remembers. And maybe, just maybe, you've walked past one of those buckets. Maybe you sat on a log under which a shovel and chain sleep side by side. Maybe the house you just moved into, maybe it wasn't always empty. Anatoly Moskvin, the doll maker. The stench was the first thing they noticed. It was cloying, not the sharp sourness of garbage or the damp rot of mildew, but sweet, like rotting fruit soaked in perfume. The apartment was dim. Curtains were drawn against the midday sun. Dust floated in heavy beams of light, suspended in the still air. Books were stacked from floor to ceiling, hundreds of them, lining the narrow corridors between walls and furniture. The smell deepened with every step. It wasn't until they turned the corner into the living room that the two officers froze. There, seated on a couch, was a doll, 4 feet tall, dressed in a lace-trimmed dress and pink bonnet, hands folded neatly in its lap. The skin was greyish, waxy, too realistic. Its glass eyes caught the light like real eyes might. A second doll slumped beside it, smaller, with braids that had once been blonde. Then a third, standing against the wall in a velvet coat. The silence pulsed. Officer Baranov stepped forward, crouched slowly, and reached out to touch the hand of the nearest doll. The fabric sleeve was stiff. Beneath it, the texture changed, leathery. He lifted the hem of the dress and saw the edge of bandages beneath, yellowed, crumbling, and something unmistakable, bone. His voice cracked when he whispered, "These aren't dolls." In the next room, there were more, on chairs, on shelves, some propped upright with wires, 26 in total, all child-sized, all dressed in girls' clothing, all decomposing, and at the center of it all, a neatly made bed with a single pillow, untouched. One of the officers turned toward the hallway. Who could do such a thing? Behind them, the apartment door clicked shut. Nizhny Novgorod was the kind of city that wore its silence well. Brutalist concrete blocks from the Soviet era, soot-streaked walls, windows always curtained. The Volga River rolled cold and grey beyond the hills, and in the long winters, everything seemed embalmed in frost. People kept their eyes down. They hurried. There were ghosts here, even if no one ever said the word. Anatoly Moskvin had always blended into the backdrop. He lived alone in a crumbling 2-story apartment with his aging parents, though they were seldom seen. A soft-spoken man in his mid-40s, Anatoly wore the same brown corduroy jacket year-round and carried a battered canvas satchel filled with academic journals. He spoke 12 languages fluently and was often consulted as an expert in Celtic history, linguistics, and Slavic pagan rituals. In the faculty lounge of the university, he was respected, even admired, for his intellect, if not his presence. But there were quirks. He avoided physical contact, never touched his food with bare hands. Colleagues said he smelled faintly of varnish and damp paper. He muttered to himself in broken Gaelic or Old Russian. He walked for hours through cemeteries, jotting things in tiny notebooks, muttering blessings over the gravestones of children. Few knew his history. Born in 1966, Anatoly was a bright, introverted child. His parents were educators, strict and pragmatic. He was not allowed to play with other children. His father feared he'd get sick. His mother feared he'd fall behind in school. So Anatoly retreated inward. He read voraciously. He developed obsessions. At age 13, something changed. He returned home from school with bruises on his face and mud in his shoes. That night, he locked himself in his room and refused to speak for 3 days. When he emerged, he was different, silent, slow, constantly scribbling. Later, he would say he had witnessed something in the cemetery, a funeral procession, a girl in a white dress being lowered into the ground. She looked right at me, he wrote in a diary entry, and blinked. He began visiting cemeteries in secret, left flowers at children's graves, whittled wooden markers for forgotten plots. His parents scolded him, but it didn't stop. As a university student, Anatoly became more reclusive. He published papers on funerary rites across ancient Europe, with a particular fixation on mummification and soul preservation. He described Egyptian, Gaelic, and Siberian death practices with unusual tenderness. His thesis posited that a child's soul, if buried too early, lingers, searching for a voice. He believed children hated the cold. No one paid much attention. Locals sometimes saw him near the old Leninskoye cemetery late at night, brushing snow from headstones, whispering lullabies to the wind. But they assumed he was eccentric, not dangerous. Professors are strange, people said, and the dead don't mind visitors. What no one knew was that he had begun sleeping near graves, that he sometimes dug with his bare hands, that he kept a small silver bell in his coat, and if he heard movement underground, he'd pause and listen. His obsession deepened after his parents fell ill. He became their caretaker. He no longer published. He declined invitations. But still, the night walks continued, sometimes for hours, sometimes until dawn. Inside his room, he began building. He took fabric, wigs, makeup. He collected dolls for parts, eyes, shoes, tiny hats. He constructed frames of wire and papier-mâché. He read manuals on embalming, taxidermy, historic preservation. He learned to make a body smile. The first time he did it, it was raining. A slow, steady drizzle that turned the soil into a black paste and muffled every sound. It was 2003, early spring, just past midnight. Anatoly moved through the rows of the Leninskoye cemetery with a practiced gait, one hand holding a flashlight wrapped in red cellophane, the other gripping a narrow spade he'd fashioned from an antique curtain rod. He knew where she was, had visited the grave twice in the past week. Maria S., age 10, died of a congenital heart defect. Her grave was recent, the soil still unsettled. He didn't think of it as exhumation. Not then, not even later. He called it retrieval. It took him 4 hours. He dug slowly, methodically, wiping his brow every few minutes. He hummed an old Russian lullaby under his breath, a tune from the 19th century. When the spade struck wood, he paused and pressed both hands into the earth, like a prayer. Then he opened the small coffin. Inside, a little girl in a white lace dress, her hands folded across her chest, her skin already starting to grey. He recoiled, not in fear, but reverence. She looked cold. He lifted her gently, wrapped her in a thick wool blanket he'd brought, and sealed the grave behind him with care, flattening the dirt, replacing the flowers. No one saw him leave. Back home, he cleaned her with warm cloths, careful not to damage her skin. He padded the hollow of her chest with rags soaked in baking soda and lavender oil. He dressed her in a long-sleeved dress, fitted gloves over her hands. Then, using a child's music box mechanism, he inserted a tiny speaker into her abdomen and sewed it shut. At the twist of a key, she could sing. He placed her on a wooden chair beside his bed. Her hair was brittle. He clipped a blonde wig into place. "I'll keep you safe now," he whispered. Over the next few weeks, he spoke to her daily, read to her from children's books, wished her good morning, and kissed her forehead before sleep. He called her Masha. He didn't think he'd do it again. But something changed. He began to hear voices. It started with dreams, children weeping in the dark, tiny fists beating on coffin lids, whispering to him through the soil. Some nights he woke with dirt under his nails, and no memory of how it got there. His journals filled with scribbled conversations, imagined dialogues with the girls. "Don't leave me here," one read. "It's cold, and I'm scared." Within 2 months, he returned to the same cemetery, then to another. Each time, he told himself it was the last. Each time, the same ritual. Select the grave, wait until night, dig carefully, carry the body home. He preserved them in different ways. Some he wrapped in cloth soaked with salt and vinegar. Others were padded with insulation foam or filled with rags. He experimented with wax, shellac, and even papier-mâché. He studied Soviet embalming techniques. His dolls evolved, more lifelike, more durable. Some had painted faces, others had button eyes, like storybook creatures. He arranged them around the apartment in sitting poses. He celebrated birthdays with them, played music. He was never alone. No one suspected. His parents, both in fragile health, spent their days confined to their own room. They were used to his quirks, the odd hours, the smells, the strange noises. They chalked it up to academic eccentricity. He assured them the dolls were for historical research. They didn't ask questions. One evening, a neighbor knocked to ask about a leak. Anatoly cracked the door, spoke briefly, then shut it with an unsteady smile. Behind him, 3 of the dolls sat facing the hallway mirror. Their reflections didn't smile back. That night, he stayed up arranging their shoes in neat rows beneath the windowsill. "The cold will seep in," he murmured, "but not to them. Not anymore." Outside, snow fell silently. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of wax and rosewater. They began to multiply. Over the next 8 years, Anatoly retrieved 26 bodies, almost all of them girls, aged 3 to 12. He kept detailed notes on each one: name, date of death, cause if known, location of the grave. He marked their birthdays on a calendar. Some of them had pet names: Katya, Liza, Dunya. Others retained their original names, etched in delicate handwriting on laminated cards he pinned to their chests like badges of honor. He didn't see them as corpses. He saw them as daughters. Each exhumation followed the same solemn process. He only visited graves where the soil had not yet settled fully. Recent burials, soft earth. He would arrive between midnight and 2 a.m., always with tools wrapped in canvas and a fresh blanket. There was never panic, never haste, only care. He refused to take boys. "They're loud," he once wrote, "rough in spirit. The girls, they whisper." The dolls filled the living room first, then the bedroom, then the hallway. He crafted small seats for them from crates and discarded chairs. Each wore different clothing, dresses he found in second-hand shops, bonnets, gloves, boots. He began sewing their garments by hand, embellishing them with ribbons and lace. Some wore beads around their necks. Others clutched faded plush animals or children's books with pages too stiff to open. Inside each doll, he placed tokens, dried flowers, photographs, old candy wrappers, religious icons. To Anatoly, these were wards. He believed that without these offerings, the souls might wander. He sealed their mouths with wax. He lined their eye sockets with glue, inserted glass beads, sometimes buttons, sometimes even painted doll eyes, depending on what he could salvage. He experimented with sound. Some bodies had music boxes, others had chips from greeting cards, activated with a press. One, Liza, sang Tumbalalaika in a tinny Yiddish lilt. His neighbors heard nothing. From the street, the apartment looked dim but lived in. Occasionally, he was spotted exiting with trash or checking the mail. A quiet academic. Nothing strange. But the atmosphere inside had changed. The air was thick, smelled faintly of formalin and lavender. Flies occasionally swarmed in summer. He taped shut the vents, kept windows closed, lit incense to mask the odor. Sometimes he spoke to them all at once, holding what he called family meetings. He would sit in the center of the room, cross-legged, surrounded by the dolls, and read aloud from children's encyclopedias. He asked them questions. He answered for them in whispery voices. He arranged them to face him, carefully turning each head. Once, when a doll slumped over, he scolded her gently. "No sulking, Anya. You know what happens to sulkers." He never explained what that meant. By 2009, the dolls began appearing in stranger forms. One had hands replaced with painted wooden spoons. Another had legs bound in copper wire and doll shoes nailed into them. One wore a dress made entirely from stitched newspaper clippings. Several had hollow chests, filled with rags and dried petals. One doll was wrapped entirely in layers of black fabric, like a cocoon. Another had no face at all, just a porcelain mask cracked down the middle. He claimed they were evolving. "I'm helping them become what they couldn't," he wrote in one journal. "They were stolen too soon. Now I give them time." But as the bodies aged, decay began to win. The skin flaked beneath the wax. Mold crept into the fabric. The smell worsened. He adjusted by using more preservatives, replacing limbs with artificial ones, patching soft tissue with foam and cotton. One doll had her head replaced entirely with a papier-mâché globe, hand-painted with stars and constellations. He named her Vesna. Each corpse became a shrine. Not a thing, but someone. Each one chosen. He never harmed them, but he didn't let them go. And in his mind, he wasn't desecrating anything. He believed, truly believed, that the girls had come to him willingly, that they spoke to him from the cold ground, that they feared loneliness more than death, that he was saving them. No one came to his door. No one suspected the scholar of death might be harboring it, until the vandalism began. Families returned to cemeteries and found graves disturbed, dirt displaced, trinkets missing. In some cases, entire coffins shifted. At first, authorities blamed local thieves, but the pattern grew, always children's graves, always girls. In 2011, after a rash of grave disturbances and complaints, the police began placing motion sensors in certain cemeteries. That led them, eventually, to Anatoly's footsteps. But by then, the dolls had taken over. In one haunting journal entry, he wrote, "They sing to me now. At night, their voices lift above the dust. I am not alone. They are grateful." He meant it. The police didn't want to believe what they were seeing. At first, the grave desecrations were written off as the work of cultists or drunks. In a city as old as Nizhny Novgorod, with its long history of war, occupation, and religious upheaval, disturbed graves weren't entirely unheard of. But as the complaints multiplied, 29 cases in less than a year, authorities were forced to act. They assigned a small task force to the matter, underfunded and unprepared. The officers followed a standard protocol: survey the damage, photograph the site, ask a few questions of cemetery staff or grieving families, and file a report. But the pattern kept repeating. Always recent graves, always children, always girls, always disturbed with care, never smashed or looted, just shifted. Then came the surveillance. In late summer 2011, the police installed motion-detecting cameras in several rural cemeteries. They weren't expecting much. The footage showed nothing for weeks. Trees swaying, cats wandering, crows picking at flowers. But then, on October 22nd, at approximately 2:41 a.m., one camera picked up a figure, male, average height, carrying a bag and a tool in his right hand. He moved slowly, paused often. He was dressed in a long coat and a flat cap, face obscured. But he didn't behave like a vandal. He crouched by a grave and seemed to speak to it for several minutes before beginning to dig. Police traced the footage to a specific plot: Yulia B., age 9. The family confirmed the grave had been tampered with. The coffin had shifted. A corner of the wooden lid was cracked. Something had been removed. They followed the footprints through the woods. Tire tracks led to a small car, registered under a familiar name, Anatoly Yurievich Moskvin, the academic, the cemetery expert. When they arrived at his building on November 2nd, they didn't bring backup. There was no anticipation of danger. Just a quiet man in a worn-out coat with a love of old languages and history. He greeted them at the door politely, invited them inside. It was the smell again that stopped them in their tracks. The odor was overpowering, a sharp chemical tang beneath layers of incense and scented candles. Something industrial, something rotten. The wallpaper was yellowed. The curtains hadn't been drawn in years. Books and newspapers towered along every wall. Then they saw them. Dolls, dozens of them, arranged along the floor, seated in chairs, leaning against the couch. Some stared blankly at the television, which played static. Others had their heads bowed in prayer. A few wore surgical masks, neatly tied. Detective Sorokin stepped closer, frowning. One of the dolls had visible fingertips, grey and dried, wrapped in gauze. Another had a hand that crumbled slightly when he touched it. Beneath the wig, the scalp was not synthetic. He turned. These are real. They called in reinforcements immediately. Forensics. Hazmat. The scene was sealed, but the news spread faster than tape. Inside, police catalogued the remains. 26 child-sized figures. Some were barely intact, reconstructed with glue, foam, and wax. Others were remarkably preserved. Each was dressed, accessorized, and labeled. Hidden inside their torsos were objects, music boxes, toys, teeth, handwritten notes. Some had voice chips sewn into their abdomens that, when activated, emitted distorted lullabies. The dolls had been arranged with purpose. Each had a place. Each had a name. Anatoly was arrested without resistance. At the station, he was calm, cooperative. He didn't deny anything. He corrected the officers when they mispronounced the girls' names. "I didn't kill them," he repeated. "I saved them." His confession was long and strange. He described how the girls spoke to him in dreams, how they begged not to be left in the earth, how he read ancient texts that suggested the dead should not lie cold and alone. He called them "my little friends," said he wanted to teach them things, read them stories, give them life again. The forensic psychiatrist on duty requested an immediate evaluation. Anatoly was declared schizophrenic with severe delusional disorder, fit for institutionalization, unfit for trial. The dolls were evidence. The families were notified, but some couldn't accept the explanation. One mother, shown photos of the doll made from her daughter, refused to believe it had been done without malice. "He played house with her," she said, shaking. "She was our child. He stole her twice." Another father collapsed in the parking lot upon hearing the condition of his daughter's remains. The media swarmed the scene. The doll maker of Nizhny Novgorod, they called him. A monster, a pervert, a freak. But inside the psychiatric facility, Anatoly remained quiet. His journals were filled with childlike drawings, notes to his daughters, poems, even lullabies. But one detail remained unexplained. A neighbor, an elderly woman in the adjacent apartment, swore she had heard giggling through the shared wall in the early hours of the morning. Not just Anatoly's voice. Others, high-pitched, playful, sometimes crying. Police dismissed it. Thin walls. The mind plays tricks. But she insisted. "They talked to him," she said. "They answered back. When asked, he never flinched." "No," Anatoly said calmly. "I never hurt them. They were already dead. I simply brought them home." The forensic teams corroborated his claim. None of the bodies bore signs of trauma unrelated to natural decomposition. There were no cuts, no broken bones, no evidence of post-mortem abuse. The death certificates all matched. The girls had died from illness, accident, or other documented causes. What Anatoly had done wasn't murder. It was something else. They searched his journals, his handwritten maps, the coded ledgers he kept in shoeboxes under his bed. Most entries were benign, lists of grave sites, flower placements, notes on funerary symbols, but some were more abstract. He wrote of soul transferences, of rituals borrowed from ancient Norse texts and obscure pagan sects. He claimed he had once attempted to reconnect a girl's soul to her preserved body using moonlight and copper wire. Another entry described a dream where dozens of small hands reached up from beneath a blanket of snow and pulled him into the earth. "I don't dig graves," he wrote in a December 2006 entry. "I rescue lost voices. I open doors." To the psychiatric staff, it was delusion, elaborate, literary, but delusion nonetheless. But then came the visitor logs. One nurse noticed something peculiar in the months after Anatoly was committed. Notes in his medical file indicated he often spoke with someone named Nastia in his room. At first, they assumed it was a hallucination, but then Anatoly became agitated when the staff moved his belongings. He claimed, "Nastia doesn't like strangers." Later, the cleaning staff discovered a small handmade doll hidden behind a vent, just 10 inches tall, made from linen and straw. It had blue beads for eyes and a lock of real human hair sewn into its head. Pinned to its chest, a scrap of paper with a name and date, Anastasia G., buried 2008. The name matched a missing grave from the Voskresenskoye cemetery. Her body had never been found. The doll had been hidden inside the psychiatric facility. When questioned, Anatoly simply smiled. "I said she didn't like to be far from me." That wasn't the only discrepancy. Police reviewed burial records and cross-referenced them with his maps. Of the 26 dolls in his apartment, 22 were definitively matched to graves. 4 were not. Their names didn't appear in any registry. Their dates of death were fictional. One of them had a name he'd used in multiple journals, Elisa. Investigators returned to the cemeteries to search for more disturbed graves. At least 3 sites were located where coffins were empty and never reported missing. 2 showed signs of recent replacement, new soil, haphazard flower arrangements. They began to wonder, had he done more than anyone realized? A deeper search into his background revealed an even stranger thread. In the 1990s, Anatoly had worked briefly with a group of esoteric historians compiling Slavic folk tales for the University of Moscow. Among the texts were old rural beliefs, myths about domovoi, household spirits and navki, the souls of unbaptized children who haunted crossroads and forests. In one passage, Anatoly had annotated a story about a bone whisperer, a man who collected lost spirits and housed them in wooden effigies to prevent them from becoming malevolent. Beside it, in his own hand, he'd written, "They don't want to be forgotten. If you give them warmth, they remember." To the police, it meant nothing. But in town, the whispers grew. Locals remembered the way Anatoly had always lingered in cemeteries. Some began to talk about hearing things near the graves. A girl crying near the fence, a voice singing beneath the frost. One groundskeeper said he once saw Anatoly digging with his bare hands and speaking into the open earth, as if someone were answering. Even among hardened detectives, there were quiet acknowledgments. The evidence didn't quite add up. He hadn't stolen valuables. He hadn't desecrated the bodies for pleasure. There was no sexual motive. And yet, he had turned their corpses into companions, ritualized their preservation. Some thought it was grief, some madness. But a few wondered if he had believed something else. One officer privately called it a reverse haunting. Not the dead haunting the living, but the living haunting the dead. In his final interview, before being moved to a high-security wing, Anatoly made one last request, to have his dolls returned to him. "They're scared without me," he said. "They've never been apart this long." The request was denied. That night, a power outage swept the hospital wing. No alarms, no malfunction, just darkness. And in the morning, a nurse reported that someone had rearranged the small dolls on the common room shelf. One had a ribbon tied around its neck that hadn't been there before. Another was missing entirely. A search turned up nothing, and Anatoly, when asked, only smiled again. "Elisa doesn't like to be watched," he said. The apartment on Akademika Sakharova Street stands silent now. After Anatoly was taken away, authorities sealed it. A rusting padlock secures the door. The curtains remain drawn, and the mailbox is stuffed with yellowing flyers and unopened envelopes. A thick layer of dust has settled on the windowsills. Neighbors pass it without speaking. Children are told not to play on that side of the building. The official verdict was clear. Anatoly Moskvin was declared criminally insane and sentenced to indefinite confinement in a psychiatric hospital in the outskirts of Nizhny Novgorod. He remains there to this day, untried, unconvicted, legally protected from prosecution due to his diagnosis. Doctors say he is lucid but unreachable. He refuses visitors. He spends his days writing letters to his girls, though the staff intercepts most of them. Once he told a psychiatrist, "I'll see them again. They're waiting. Just not here." He is now in his late 50s. His parents have passed. No relatives have claimed his property. Legally, it belongs to the state. The dolls were destroyed. Forensic teams photographed and catalogued each one before cremation. Families were offered what remains could be salvaged, though most declined. A few insisted on reburial, sealed beneath reinforced concrete slabs. Others moved away, unable to remain in the same city where their daughters' graves had been emptied. But not all of them were accounted for. 3 sets of remains, 3 of Anatoly's girls, were never matched to known graves. Their identities remain a mystery. Officials closed the file in 2013, citing a lack of evidence for further action. Yet, the unease lingers. Local legend has taken root. Children whisper stories of a man who comes at night, offering lost girls a second chance to wake up. Teenagers dare each other to break into the dollmaker's apartment, but none ever get close. One boy, they say, got inside once, years later. He returned pale and shaking, speaking of a soft music playing in the dark and the faint scent of lavender. He wouldn't go near a doll again. And sometimes, on nights when the wind presses against the windows just so, residents of the building swear they can hear something from the second floor. A quiet voice, maybe, or a child's song. Just a trick of the draft. Just a creaking pipe. Nothing more. But still, what if he's still out there? And the house you just moved into, the one with the sealed room and the lingering perfume, was the place where the last girl was found. Tsutomu Miyazaki, the human Dracula of Japan. The body was not whole. A blue plastic lunchbox rested by the moss-covered stones of the Tama River, placed there with almost reverent care. The morning fog curled gently around it like a veil, as if nature itself tried to hide what lay inside. A fisherman, thinking it trash, pried it open with the tip of his rod. He never fished again. Inside, the head of a small girl. Her skin, pale as wax, retained an eerie softness, preserved in the cold. Her hair had been brushed and tied with a yellow ribbon. Her mouth was slightly open, revealing a row of milk teeth. Her eyelids were closed, not peacefully, but tightly shut, pressed by someone else's hand. Around her neck, remnants of bruising in the shape of fingers. What was most unsettling wasn't the head itself, but how clean it was, as if it had been cared for. Tucked beneath the chin was a small note, typed, not handwritten. It read, "Reincarnation is not painless." No signature. No. A few days later, her parents received a second package. This one came in a cardboard box. Inside was her school uniform, burned in patches and reeking of oil, and a small glass jar. Within it, a muddy ash suspended in liquid. DNA testing would later confirm it was her bone dust. The case lit up the media. Panic spread like gasoline. Mothers clutched their daughters' hands tighter. School children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Everyone asked the same question. Who could do such a thing to a child? But there was no face, no motive, no pattern, just the unbearable knowledge that someone, somewhere, had watched her die, and then prepared her body like a gift. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born in 1962 in a suburb of Tokyo that had not yet caught up with the neon modernity of the capital. Its narrow streets still smelled of earth after rain, and neighbors still bowed deeply when they passed. But inside the Miyazaki home, things were quieter, too quiet. From birth, Tsutomu's body had betrayed him. A congenital defect fused the bones in his hands. Instead of moving fluidly like a pianist's, his fingers were curled permanently inward, like claws. He could not rotate his wrists. Children in school noticed. They called him Crab behind his back. He didn't speak to many, and they didn't try to speak to him. He learned early to hide. His father, a successful local newspaper publisher, refused to acknowledge the deformity. "Just use your other muscles," he told his son once, eyes never leaving the dinner table. Tsutomu nodded. He always nodded. The family reputation mattered more than the boy's loneliness. There were signs, of course. Teachers noted his aversion to physical contact. One psychiatrist, consulted briefly in junior high, wrote, "Emotionally muted, possibly dissociative, parents not receptive." At home, he found solace in isolation. His grandfather, one of the few who paid him attention, introduced him to photography. They spent weekends developing film in the garage turned darkroom. But when the old man died, suddenly, of illness, Tsutomu began to change. He kept the man's ashes in a tea canister by his bed. He said it helped him sleep. When his mother threw it away, thinking it morbid, he didn't eat for days. That was the first time he heard the voice. He told no one. Years passed. Tsutomu grew quieter, retreating into manga and horror films. His university years were unremarkable. He didn't make friends, didn't date. He failed out of studies, returned home, and worked part-time in his father's office doing errands and deliveries. By now, his room had become a museum of nightmares. Shelves sagged under the weight of VHS tapes, hundreds of them, featuring graphic horror, slasher films, and documentaries on serial killers. He catalogued them obsessively. He rewound and paused, taking notes. His favorite scenes were not the killing, but the moments before it, the tension, the fear. What fascinated him was not death, but anticipation. His mother noticed, but said nothing. His father ignored him completely. By 1988, Tsutomu was 26 and invisible. To the neighbors, he was a quiet young man who helped carry groceries for old ladies and mumbled polite greetings. His awkward gait and withdrawn posture made him seem simple, even harmless. But behind the sliding door of his bedroom, something monstrous gestated. He had acquired a second-hand video camera and began filming things. At first, nature, then strangers, then children in the park, playing alone. He would watch the tapes late into the night, whispering questions to the screen. "Would you cry? Would you run? Would you forgive me?" He started keeping journals, pages filled with sketches of girls, headless or bound. He wrote scripts, short monologues in the voice of an imagined killer. They were articulate, poetic even. One began, "Fear is a blossom that opens in silence." He practiced reading them aloud in front of the mirror, and then, in the summer of that year, he followed a girl from the park. Just to see where she lived, he told himself, just to know. He didn't touch her, not yet, but it was already too late. It was a Sunday, hot, slow, and quiet. 4-year-old Marikono had been playing outside while her older sister napped inside the family's small apartment in Hachioji, a western suburb of Tokyo. Her mother had stepped out for groceries, leaving the girls alone for what she believed would be 20 minutes. The sun filtered through the thin curtains. A television played in the background. The screen door was left ajar. Tsutomu Miyazaki watched from the shadows of the park across the street. He had seen Mari before, twice. She had a habit of talking to birds, of placing breadcrumbs along the curb, of speaking to herself in little songs. He liked that. He liked her voice. By the time her sister woke and realized Mari was gone, the street was empty. No one remembered seeing a man, but the old woman 2 blocks down swore she'd heard the ice cream truck playing a tune that hadn't been heard in years. That same night, Tsutomu took Mari to his family's secluded mountain cabin in Saitama Prefecture, where they rarely visited. He had prepared it carefully, blackout curtains, soundproofing, and his camera tripod in the corner. His journal from that day reads in stiff, emotionless print. Subject: female, approx. 4 years, compliant. First contact, no resistance. Vocalization soft. Clothing, white and red, no shoes. What happened inside the cabin lasted hours. There were no screams. Not at first. He gave her juice. He asked her name, though he already knew. He spoke gently. He told her she was in a dream, that this was all a game. She believed him. He played music to keep her calm. He filmed her sitting in a chair, looking confused, blinking into the light. And then he changed. She was strangled. Not immediately. He covered her mouth first, then held her down until she stopped moving. His hands, those curled, inhuman hands, left bruises like hooks. He stripped her carefully, not sexually, but as if undressing a doll. Then, with a small knife, he opened her, not with rage, but precision. He removed her hands and placed them beside her head. He watched her face as the light left her eyes, then whispered, "Thank you." He left her body near a wooded stream and returned 2 days later with a camera. The scene had decayed. He recorded everything: the position of the body, the angle of the sunlight, the insects. He spoke into the microphone like a nature documentarian. "This is Mari, day 2, he said. "Decomposition beginning, skin softening, still beautiful." Later, he took the head and brought it home. His notes describe how he preserved it in a lunchbox with dry ice. He did not keep it for sexual reasons. He kept it for company. He said the head spoke to him. He told it stories. He believed the soul was still there, just confused. His grandfather's spirit, he claimed, had been reborn in her. Her family's grief became national news. But there were no clues. No ransom, no witness, no suspect. The police focused on the family, then on local perverts, but nothing fit. 2 weeks later, the Kono family received the box. Inside, Mari's school bag, singed, her remaining teeth blackened, a typed letter. It read, "Mari played with me. We watched the river together. Her bones sang." Forensic psychologists were baffled. The killer was intelligent, methodical, and completely unhinged. But there was no ego in the writing, no signature, just the slow unspooling of madness. Tsutomu kept watching the news, quietly. He recorded the news segments onto VHS tapes and labeled them meticulously. Case Study 1, Mari. He filed it under his bed, right next to the empty lunchbox. The second girl was 6 years old. Masami Yoshizawa vanished just 3 months after Mari. It was mid-October, and the trees were bleeding red along the quiet back roads of Iruma, another Tokyo suburb. Her school reported her absent after lunch. A missing persons notice went out before sunset. She was gone. No struggle. No sound. Tsutomu had followed her for days, waiting for the right moment. He later wrote in his journal, "Masami walked with rhythm. She hummed, unaware of the gaze. She reminded me of a moth, delicate and unknowing of fire." Unlike Mari, Masami resisted. She screamed when he grabbed her from behind. He hit her twice, then stuffed a towel into her mouth. She was unconscious by the time they reached the car. The blood on the back seat dried brown before he reached the cabin. This time, he didn't offer juice. He filmed her tied to a chair, her arms trembling. His voice was calm, instructing her to sit still, to listen closely, as if he were a teacher correcting posture. The tape would later be recovered, its audio muffled but unmistakable. Masami begging in short, broken phrases. "I want go home. I be good. Please." He killed her by forcing her head underwater in the cabin's tiny metal sink. She thrashed. Her small hands beat against the counter. He held her until there was no more sound. Then he dismembered her. This time, he removed her lower jaw. He boiled the bones to clean them and kept the teeth in a clear plastic case. He arranged the rest of her remains along a tree line and returned weeks later to collect her skull. In December, he mailed the Yoshizawa family a Christmas card. Inside was a photo, a black and white Polaroid of a child's hand resting on a rock. Her fingernails had been painted post-mortem. The third victim, Erika Namba, was abducted in March the following year. Tsutomu had altered his approach, more confident now, less cautious. He took her near a shopping center after luring her with the promise of a rare toy he claimed to have in his car. Erika, only 4, believed him. Her body was found the next day in a cemetery parking lot. She had been burned. Her hands and feet were missing. A set of small pink shoes had been placed neatly beside her, soles wiped clean. There was no note, no signature, just a single clue, an audio cassette left at the scene. When police played it, they heard only static. And then, after nearly 20 seconds, a voice, Tsutomu's, breathless, whispering, "What is a soul made of? Can you still feel her?" The fourth and final known victim, Ayako Nomoto, was different. She was older, 7 years old, and Tsutomu did not follow her. He approached her directly in a park, pretending to ask for help carrying a box to his car. There were witnesses this time. One described him as nervous, twitching like a bird. Another recalled his hands, calling them strange, like crab claws. Ayako's abduction was clumsy. She struggled. He panicked. He hit her with a metal object and stuffed her into the back of the car. She died en route to the cabin. This time, the killing wasn't methodical. It was desperate, erratic. He mutilated the body, removed her legs, and attempted to burn them in a makeshift fire pit. He took her torso home, wrapped in plastic, and stored it in a closet. His final act was to mail her mother a box filled with ashes, hair, and a note written in phonetic child speak. She cold now, she with star. Tokyo police were in chaos. No pattern. No clear forensic link between scenes. The media dubbed the killer the otaku murderer after it was discovered that strange anime paraphernalia had been left at one dump site. A single VHS tape of a horror cartoon featuring demonic children. He had now killed 4 girls in under a year. He filmed 3 of them. He drank blood from at least 2. His journals described the taste as warm and silent. He believed it would help him speak to the other side. Somewhere between fantasy and delusion, Tsutomu Miyazaki began to see himself not as a murderer, but a medium. A bridge between innocence and eternity, a servant of death. And Tokyo slept less and less. The task force assembled in Tokyo was the largest since the Monster with 21 Faces case. Over 40 officers combed through evidence, but each new clue led only deeper into fog. There were no fingerprints, no reliable sightings. The killer's mailings offered no DNA, and the letters were typed on an obscure model of word processor, popular but impossible to trace. A profile emerged. Male, 20s to 30s, likely unemployed or working flexible hours. Intelligent, introverted, possibly obsessive. But in a city of millions, that profile matched too many. The families waited. Their grief turned bitter, then cold. The Kono family moved away. Masami's father suffered a nervous breakdown. Erika's mother attempted suicide, and the public demanded answers. But the killer stayed ahead. He moved bodies before police arrived. He used new dump sites each time. And the letters, chilling, poetic, precise, mocked the police without being overt. It was not ego, it was performance. One note sent to the Namba family included a hand-drawn image of a weeping girl in a cage, surrounded by disembodied eyes. At the bottom, she saw too much, so now she sees nothing. Some detectives began to suspect they were dealing with someone theatrical, someone who saw the killings not just as crimes, but as expressions. They began interviewing manga shop owners and horror collectors. The term otaku entered the investigation vocabulary, a label for reclusive obsessives. The media grabbed it, of course. Otaku killer ran in bold headlines, painting a portrait of a nation rotting from inside, where violent manga warped young minds and technology bred monsters. But none of this brought them closer to a name. Until July 23rd, 1989. A man was spotted in Itabashi, loitering near an elementary school, filming children. When one of the girls screamed and ran, he followed her to her house and attempted to force entry. Her father confronted him. The man fled, but neighbors gave chase. He was tackled and pinned. At first, he said nothing. Then, when asked for ID, he gave his real name, Tsutomu Miyazaki. The arrest seemed like luck. Nothing connected him yet to the killings. He was booked for attempted abduction. But during the initial search of his room, police opened a closet and found something no one could explain. Over 5,000 videotapes. Many were horror films. Others were homemade. Several featured footage of news reports about the murders, painstakingly recorded, catalogued, and labeled. The spine of one tape read, "Mari, smile last time." Another read simply, "Ashes." But it was the photographs that sealed it. Hundreds of images, some of decomposing bodies, others of dismembered hands, shoes, skull fragments, all taken in natural light, carefully composed. One officer who viewed them vomited in the hallway. Beneath the floorboards they found more. Children's clothes, bloodied gauze, the remains of burned journals. In one envelope, an unsent letter. "This will be the last, but not for me. The silence will stay, and I will walk within it." Miyazaki did not resist. In custody, he was eerily polite. He asked if the camera had been recovered, seemingly more concerned about the footage than his own fate. During interviews, he sometimes spoke in the third person. Other times, he claimed a second being lived within him, a shadow self who committed the acts. He called it Ratman. He said Ratman told him what to do, whispered when to go to the park, when to take a girl. Ratman liked the silence after the screaming stopped. Psychologists debated his sanity. Some declared him a paranoid schizophrenic with dissociative tendencies. Others believed he was calculating, fully aware, using the performance of madness to avoid the noose. But one thing was consistent. He showed no remorse. He described the murders clinically, with the tone of a man dissecting a film he'd already seen. He once paused an interview to critique the way one photo was taken by police. "The angle," he said, "misses the loneliness in her eyes." One detective later recalled that when asked why he drank blood, Tsutomu replied, "Because it stopped the noise." In the press, he became both monster and myth, a vampire, a demon, a cultural symptom. But in the quiet hours of police interrogation, he was just a man, pale, soft-voiced, and staring at his hands like he didn't quite believe they were his. They expected guilt, tears at least, maybe confusion. But when Tsutomu Miyazaki entered the courtroom in 1990, it was with the dispassionate gaze of someone arriving late to a screening of his own movie. He wore thick glasses, his posture curled inward like a question mark. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. The trial lasted 7 years. Not because of complexity, his guilt was evident, but because the court could not decide what kind of man they were dealing with. He never denied the murders, but he never quite confessed either. Instead, he described his crimes as sequences. He recounted events in past tense, like a documentary narrator, sometimes even correcting the prosecutor on minor details. "The first girl," he said on day 3, "did not cry when I took her. She only asked where her sister was." In the gallery, Mari's mother collapsed. To Tsutomu, this wasn't cruelty. It was memory. He spoke with flat affect, detached, like an editor assembling a narrative from film clips. He sometimes drifted into strange digressions, comparing the color of dried blood to the paint used in 1970s horror cinema. Once, when asked about Masami's final moments, he paused, smiled faintly, and said, "It reminded me of that scene in Guinea Pig 2, the silence just before the scream." He spoke of fear like a critic speaks of lighting. He did not weep, not once. He did not apologize. Instead, he categorized. Each killing was a case, each dismemberment a gesture. He called them rituals of return, a phrase no one could fully unpack. He believed the girls were vessels. He said he felt their spirits after death, hovering near. One psychiatrist called it a cinematic dissociation so complete he no longer knew he was real. Another disagreed. "He's not insane, he's simply in love with death, with image, with himself." And then came the moment no one could forget. On the 4th day of cross-examination, the prosecutor projected an image of Mari Kono's severed head, the one recovered from the lunchbox. The courtroom held its breath. Tsutomu leaned forward slowly. For the first time, he smiled. Not grotesquely, not with joy. It was something quieter, recognition. Then he said, "That's the only one I framed correctly." The room went cold. Throughout the trial, he referred to the murders as if they had already been filmed, already consumed. The parents were witnesses not to confession, but to commentary. He was not explaining why he did it. He was explaining why it worked. His lawyers attempted an insanity defense, pointing to his journals, his Ratman hallucinations, his belief that his grandfather still spoke to him through the girl's bones. But the court found him coherent. Disturbed, yes, but sane. The psychiatrist's final report concluded, "He is not detached from reality. He has replaced it with narrative." The judge agreed. In 1997, after nearly a decade of proceedings, Tsutomu Miyazaki was sentenced to death by hanging. When the verdict was read, he showed no emotion. He adjusted his glasses. He asked if he could have his tapes returned. No one answered. The press hounded the story for years. Debates raged about censorship, mental illness, the role of violent media. Horror manga was briefly banned in some prefectures. Otaku culture was demonized. Filmmakers, ironically, began adapting elements of his story into thrillers. But the footage he recorded, the original tapes, were never released to the public. Only a handful of officers and court officials ever saw them. One officer, anonymously, described them this way: "There's no gore, no screaming, just stillness. A girl sitting in a chair, a voice off camera saying, 'Can you look at me now?'" Even after his sentencing, Tsutomu continued to write. One letter to a former psychiatrist ended with the line, "The film isn't over. You just turned off the screen." The killer, it seemed, didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as an auteur. Tsutomu Miyazaki spent over a decade on death row. He was held in solitary confinement at the Tokyo detention house, his contact with the outside world limited to monthly visits from his court-appointed attorneys, and the occasional journalist willing to exchange questions for silence. He never admitted remorse. When asked years later what he thought of the death penalty, he replied, "That's the final scene. Every film needs an ending." In 2008, he was hanged. It was done in the early morning, without public announcement. The Justice Minister signed the order with little ceremony. Tsutomu's body was cremated, his ashes unclaimed. No one in his family came to collect them. But the killings didn't end. Not really. In the years that followed, strange rumors emerged in the quiet neighborhoods of Saitama and Hachioji. Whispered tales of a man with deformed hands seen standing at dusk near schoolyards. A pale figure glimpsed behind trees, filming. Dogs refusing to enter the wooded park near the old cabin. One family, new to the area, moved into a modest house on the edge of the forest. The rent was low. The landlord said nothing of the past. Their 6-year-old daughter began waking at night, saying a man was standing in her room. She described him in perfect detail. His fingers were bent like they were broken. They installed a security camera. It caught nothing. But one morning, on the windowsill outside her room, they found a single object, a Polaroid. It showed the child, asleep in bed, taken from outside the window. On the back, someone had written, "She dreams in silence now." The police investigated. They found nothing. No prints, no intruder, just the whisper of something unfinished. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves a certain way through the pine trees near the old cabin, local children say you can still hear it, the faint click of a shutter, a voice just outside the edge of sleep. "Look at me now.